It's a super exciting conference, and I'm honored to be part of it. So the paper is called Reading Twitter in the Newsroom, How Social Media Affects Traditional Media Reporting of Conflicts. And this is joint work with Safi At, who is in Ernest Lyon, and my graduate student, Etienne Madinier, who will be on the market next year. So somebody to look at potentially. And we start with a very simple observation that social media has completely changed, revolutionized the informational world around us. And in addition to changing how ordinary people consume and share information, social media has become an important source of information for professional journalists as well. Or at least so they say. For example, Alan Rusberger, former editor-in-chief of The Guardian, said, and I quote, "Increasingly, news happens first on Twitter. Even if you're in the news business and have access to wires, the chances are that you will check out many rumors of breaking news on Twitter first." And indeed, this is confirmed by various surveys. For example, 56% of US journalists claim that social media are an important source of information for them, and over 90% say that social media plays some role. In addition, there are some evidence that Twitter is particularly used by traditional journalists. And if you read through communication research, you see that there are a number of important conjectures that communication scholars have formulated about how social media affects traditional media. And in particular, they suggest that that social media transforms eyewitnesses into what they call citizen journalists, or essentially those reporters who can report from the field, allowing news to be both posted and accessed in real time, which of course leads to the conclusion which Rusberger said, that you can get information even before the news wires. And perhaps more importantly, potentially that could change the perception of the events on the ground by traditional journalists, and then by the public, which afterwards consumes news which are produced by traditional journalists. And of course, social media also serves an important indicator of demand for news on a particular topic, which means that some journalists will pick a topic when there is space constraints, which is trending on Twitter. Given all of these very important conjectures, it is surprising that there is very little systematic evidence of this. And in fact, there is only one paper by Julia Caget, which is very recent, where she shows that with her co-authors that online editions of French mainstream media cover stories which are trending on French Twitter. Yet, we really do not know much about how the content of the news is affected by social media. And this is where we come in with this paper, because we are trying to fill exactly that gap. So our research question is how information available on social media affects TV reporting of conflicts. And in particular, we show, and let me just summarize the punchline in essentially one sentence, we show that when social media is not muted by the internet outages in Israel and Palestine, it causes larger coverage of this conflict on US TV. And perhaps more importantly, and this is where we really see our main contribution, it changes both the content and the tonality of the conflict coverage by traditional news, making it both more emotional and more focused on sufferings of civilians and less focused on other topics, like, for example, the role of US foreign policy officials. So let me just give you a little bit of context. So first of all, why do we focus on conflict? Maybe it's not important to say that in this particular audience, but generally it would be good to answer that question. And essentially we expect that one should expect that social media should matter for conflict-related news more than potentially for other news, because it is very hard to produce news about conflicts, both due to unpredictability of conflict events, but also for security reasons for the traditional journalists. Second, we focus on the US TV because it actually does remain an important source of news for 44% of US population, despite the rise of the social media. And there are twofold reason why we focus on Israeli-Palestinian conflict. First, it's a very convenient source of data because it's long-lasting, comparable, and measurable series of newsworthy events. But it also is relevant because US TV does cover this conflict and US public is interested in it. In particular, in 37% of days with deadly attacks during our observation period, there was at least one news story on US TV about this conflict. Furthermore, both sides of the conflict are on social media and think that it's very important. For example, IDF spokesperson said, and I quote, "Facebook and Twitter are the battlefields. It is there that we fight each and every day." And I should also quote from the Palestinian social media activist awareness campaign, which teaches its users that anyone killed or martyred is to be called a civilian from Gaza or Palestine before we talk about his status in jihad. And guess what? It turns out that indeed US TV directly uses the social media feed in its coverage of the conflict. And in this slide, what you see is 4 screenshots of the CNN in which CNN directly quotes a tweet feed from a 16-year-old girl from Gaza who was just basically telling what she saw during the Gaza war in 2014. This girl is called Sarah Baker, and she was completely unknown before she started her Twitter account. Now she's a world star because all traditional media journalists actually picked up on her. And as you can see, they not only directly quoted from her Twitter, they also showed videos which she posted and she filmed from the balcony of her house when the bombs were falling around her house. So overall, let me just come to what we do with this in order to systematically get some evidence on something which essentially the story of Sarah Baker already tells you. So the data which we use are fourfold. First, we use the data on conflict, and let me say that the time span which we cover is from 2009 to 2016. So these are the daily data on the number of casualties on each side. We have a very detailed data on TV, on the US TV. Particularly, we have full transcripts of all news shows aired on all main US TV networks. And just to be precise, let me say that we have data on ABC, CBS, NBC, CNN, Fox, MSNBC, PBS, and Bloomberg. And also we use Al Jazeera data as a benchmark. And there, using keywords, we can identify all stories related to the conflict zone. And it turns out to be about 23,000 of stories which were aired during this period of time in the US TV about Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The third big source of data for us is Twitter. And what we did, we scrapped the population of tweets during our observation period with specific keywords: Palestine, Israel, and Gaza. So we have all of them. Particularly, there are 50 million of them. Then we localized them using self-reported user profile. And it turns out that according to this self-reporting, 9% of all these tweets come from the conflict zone. Then we use machine learning algorithm to identify which of these tweets are conflict related. And in particular, it turns out that about 1 million of tweets come from Israel and 1 million of tweets come from Palestine. And the fourth source of data is internet outages, and I will talk about it more when we discuss identification. So let me just say that not only the US TV has stories about Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but of course, what they say is affected by what's happening on the ground. And in particular, in this graph, you see that there is more coverage of the conflict zone by US TV when something serious is going on, particularly when there are casualties. And of course, essentially exactly the same thing you can say about what's happening with the conflict-related tweets from the conflict zone, particularly when there are serious attacks by Israeli Defense Forces. We see that the Twitter explodes And that's what you see on this graph. And what we want to do is something which has a lot of identification challenges. Particularly, we want to estimate the causal relationship between how and whether the US TV covers this conflict and what's happening on social media in the conflict zone. And here we use a number of tweets from the conflict zone as essentially as an aggregation of all social media activity in Israel and Palestine. And of course, we control for what's going on the ground and a series of fixed effects for seasonality and so on and so forth. But no matter how well we can control for all these things, the main challenge is, of course, indigeneity of the number of tweets. Of course, there is reverse causality, tweets could follow whatever is covered by TV, and perhaps more importantly, because of the time difference, there is, of course, enormous amount of omitted variables. There are unobservable newsworthiness of the attacks, which may drive both tweeting in the conflict zone and coverage by the US TV. And of course, there could be important other events which could crowd out both at the same time. So what do we do? Well, in addition to controlling for all observable characteristics, we need to instrument this flow of tweets. And we do this using the internet outages locally, which take place in Israel and Palestine. And there are two sources of these internet outages which we use. First, we use data on exact location and time of all cloud-to-ground lightning strikes during the thunderstorms in Israel and Palestine. And it is very well known from engineers that lightning strikes create electrostatic discharges which particularly affect the ICT infrastructure. And it causes the internet connectivity disruptions, particularly for the mobile phone, but also for the stationary internet and mobile internet. And that reduces the ability to connect to internet in case that people do not have the power surge protection. And what we do, we just use dummies for days with lightning strikes in places where people live in this conflict zone. The second source of internet outages, which we use, come from technical failures. And we use the methodology which was developed by computer scientists to identify these outages. In particular, it measures traffic between a certain geographical area. In our case, this is Israel and Palestine, and the rest of the World Wide Web. So basically, in order to tweet, you need to connect local user with the server of Twitter, which is located in the US. And in normal times, there's always traffic because there are always some active IP addresses, and there are many of them. And the computer scientists suggest that a sudden decrease in traffic is a sign of this technical failure, which leads to internet outages. And indeed, if you plot the traffic over time, you see that there are some significant internet outages which happen during our observation period. So, of course, in order to use these variations as instrument, they need to satisfy certain requirements. Well, first, these need to be relevant. They need to have predictive power. And just to illustrate the relevance of these internet outages, we use the Islamic prayer bot from Gaza, which is an automatic service informing Muslims of prayer times. And we see that if we link the times when this prayer bot didn't tweet when it was supposed to tweet, with the lightnings in the conflict zone, with the sudden drop in visible traffic, and with our union of this, which is internet outage, we see that there is a significant relationship between that, one and the other. And just to illustrate overall our first stage, here again, there is a plain summary of the data where on the vertical axis we have mean number of daily tweets about the conflict, and we summarize them for days with and without internet outage in the conflict zone. And indeed, what we see here is that, of course, the internet outage doesn't completely block tweeting activity, which is reasonable, because if you have power surge protection technology or if you have satellite internet, you're not affected by this by this instrument. And it's worth noting that once we put in all of our covariates, the relationship not only survives, but becomes stronger. But of course, relevance is only one thing which is needed from the instrument. So first, we need to argue that there is an indigeneity of it. So first, the instrument and its components should not be related to newsworthiness of the attacks. And of course, this is untestable in general, but it is testable as far as the observables go. And indeed, we see that instrument is not associated with the number of casualties in either on either side of the conflict. We also need to ask ourselves the question, could it be that these sudden drop of traffic be caused by the strategically by the conflict actors? And here one could only argue that in principle, Israel has the technology to do this. And if so, they would only do this in times when something newsworthy is going on, for example, Palestinian protests. But that would bias our estimates against finding the effect. However, we still use it because actually computer scientists tell us that silencing of social media usually is done by jamming rather than by pulling the plug, because pulling the plug is too costly. And the jamming is associated with higher rather than lower traffic, and therefore is not affecting our instrument. But anyway, we have full robustness to everything I'm going to tell you about as far as the results are concerned by to using only Lightning IV. Furthermore, we also need to think about the exclusion restriction. In particular, what we'd like is an instrument which affects the ability of these potential citizen journalists to connect to social media, but wouldn't affect other sources of information of traditional journalists. And the main source of information for covering the foreign conflict is newswires. And we collected information on newswires, and we see that newswire reports about Israeli-Palestinian conflict are not correlated with either component of our instrument, whereas tweets are. And the reason for this essentially is because the Agence France-Presse, Reuters, and Associated Press, of course, have satellite internet and all other ways in which they can avoid internet blackouts when they occur in the conflict zone. So with this, let me come finally to the discussion of the results. And there are three sets of results which we present. First, we talk about the effect of social media in the conflict zone on the extent of coverage of this conflict by the US TV. Then we talk about the emotions provided that there is coverage, and then about which topics US TV talks about within their coverage of this whole conflict once they decide to do this. And here again, you see the plain summary of the data, which essentially give you all what one needs to know as far as how these Twitter in the conflict zone, social media in the conflict zone affects the extent of coverage by the US TV. In particular, we can summarize the fraction of the probability of primetime coverage, of having a story about the conflict, the whole length of the news stories about conflict throughout the 24-hour news cycle, the number of news stories, and if we just count the keywords related to the conflict zone, all of these are related to the presence of internet outages on the ground. And I just want to mention that once we put in all our controls, it survives. And what you see here is the second stage effect on primetime coverage, number of stories, and the length of the broadcast. But we also see that the extent of coverage is affected both on the extensive and on the intensive margin. Particularly the length is larger provided that there is coverage, and also we show that it's not driven by just the times of the intensified conflict. So with this, let me proceed to the effect on emotions. And for that, we use the emotions lexicon, so to say, which basically assigns to each word a score from 0 to 1 for the basic emotions: anger, fear, sadness, disgust, joy, trust, anticipation, and surprise. And for each of the conflict-related broadcasts, we sum them up and divide by the number of words. We also use a more sophisticated contextual sentiment analysis, which uses score, which calculates a score for each conflict-related story that takes into account the degree modifiers, contrasting sentences, and negations, but essentially the results are the same. And let me summarize them here with this reduced form graph again. So we see that when social media are not muted in the conflict zone, the US TV broadcast on the conflict becomes more angry, more fearful, with more disgust, more sadness, and even the positive emotions are also there, but this is less precisely estimated. And once you include controls, you will see that it's not significant. And let me just tell you that these summaries, they hide something very important, heterogeneity according to what's happening on the ground. And it turns out that not only Twitter makes US TV broadcast more emotional, but actually all of this effect comes from the times when there are Palestinian casualties. And there's no extra effect of Twitter on emotional tonality of the broadcast when there is Israeli casualties. And that's what you see from these estimates. So finally, let me come to the discussion of the topics. So why would the US TV broadcast be more emotional? What are they talking about when the social media are not muted in the conflict zone? And here I just summarize some of the data again. And in order to understand the topics, what we do, we just count keywords on each particular topic and then again divide by the total number of words in the broadcast. And we see that there is more talk when social media are not muted in the conflict zone about the ordinary people, and particularly about young people, about children, about babies, and that's what we see here. There is also a lot more talk about civilian casualties. There is more mentions of amateur pictures and videos. There is more mention of exact ammunition used. And that's important because that basically tells us that we have more details in the US TV broadcast, but at the same time, we see that there are other topics like mentions of US foreign policy officials, which is mentioned less when US TV chooses to talk about the conflict once there is a social media feed which they can rely on. Finally, I just want to mention, if they compare what different networks talk about once they cover the conflict during the same time, in the same day, we see that with social media non-muted, there is more similarity in the traditional media coverage of this conflict. And let me just skip some of these exact details and just point to the fact that when US TV talks about civilian suffering, this is particularly true. The effect of Twitter on that is particularly magnified in presence of Palestinian victims. So with this, let me just come to the final point, which I want to communicate to you before concluding. So we can do a back of the envelope exercise to really try to understand which side of the conflict actually benefits from this effect of social media. And in particular, outside of times of intensified conflict, we see that the additional tweets as a result of no internet outages increase the probability of US TV mentions of civilian casualties by 7 percentage points with each additional 10 Israeli victims, and by 5.6 percentage points for each additional 10 Palestinian victims. So per victim, Israelis actually get more coverage because of social media. Yet there is on average 10 times more casualties on the Palestinian side than on the Israeli side. And therefore, on average, in any given time period, additional TV coverage of conflict due to the absence of these blackouts of internet in the conflict zone is devoted to covering Palestinian civilian victims. And the difference is 8 times compared to Israeli victims. Let me, for the sake of,
I know that at the end of the slot.
Sorry?
10 minutes till the end of your slot.
10 minutes?
Till the end of your slot with questions.
Great. Excellent. So let me conclude with this, because that's good time. So just to sum up, social media does change reporting by traditional media. And this is particularly important in times of conflict. And these social media released from the conflict zones increases the coverage by traditional media, makes it more emotional, particularly in presence of victims from the side which bears a higher civilian death toll. And even though there is the TV broadcast is focused on portraying civilian suffering on both sides, eventually that helps underdog more. And that essentially highlights the democratizing role of social media. Let me stop here. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Katya. Now we have time for questions. So if you have questions, please raise your hand, or you can start talking. Like, oh yeah, we have hands. Hannes?
Thank you. Fantastic, really interesting paper. I find this really fascinating. I would like to know whether you have thought about, like, you know, given that these are also managed campaigns, right? These are, as you say in the beginning, this is really like there is a kind of information war going on, and kind of the social media is kind of the raw material for this war, right? So kind of like the outages mean that you don't have it at a sudden, but you want to use it, right? That's what you show. And I would be really interested whether you can kind of back this up with differentiating the different slant of the US media and check whether, you know, more right-wing would use more Israeli, I don't know, or like whether you know what the biases are, and whether like, okay, you have it here. Sorry, I missed it. Sorry.
No, I didn't say anything about it. I skipped it. So thanks very much for this question. So we are trying to see what are the heterogeneity between different networks. And in particular here, you see we sorted networks from more conservative to more liberal. By the way, that doesn't necessarily mean that they are from more pro-Israel to more pro-Palestine, but, you could assume a little bit that this is true for PBS, which actually covers a lot more, like, for example, Mahmoud Abbas. And at the end, at the bottom, we see the effects on Al Jazeera, which is definitely more pro-Palestinian compared to any of the US networks. So what we see here is that generally there is no heterogeneity on the extent of coverage. It seems like there's similar effects on everything. But as far as tonality is concerned, what you see is that there is absolutely nothing on PBS, which is the most liberal of all networks. And the same is in the shift towards coverage of the ordinary people. But most of the effects are concentrated for the more conservative media, but of course also centrist, like CNN and MSNBC. But that's basically as much as we can say for now. With this, it is important to note also that Al Jazeera is, of course, a benchmark. However, their broadcast is already a lot more emotional than of any of the US networks. So the fact that we don't see much here may mean that you cannot really increase emotionality of their broadcast. And they do certainly cover things like, you know, what's going on the ground in Gaza. So that's maybe why we don't see additional effect on covering things like, you know, babies dying.
Cool. And did
that's
you
as much as we can do. Yeah, please.
Did you check by government? Like, because of course this is also trying to influence government, and maybe some governments are more listening to what's coming out of the US media, right? And then the incentives to use emotional content might go up or down depending on who's in government, right? And so I would expect, for example, Fox News to become much more emotional when Trump is in power, and so maybe you could kind of think about, like, you know, because they're trying to influence policies, right? So maybe it's also.
We haven't done it, and it's an excellent suggestion. We'll look.
Cool, fantastic, thank you.
Yeah, I don't know to what extent our instrument will bite if we have the sub periods, because because, well, it definitely will be fine for the extent of coverage, but in the content, we need to work only with those days when they actually cover. So it's, we'll try and we'll report back. Thanks.
So we have two more questions. One is from Yehuda, and
yes, hello.
next is Giacomo. Yeah.
Hello, I found it very interesting, especially I like the instruments, but I have two questions. First of all, about the lightning instrument. Does the weather affect the probability of intensity of conflict? I mean, I saw that you control for rain or weather, but since lightning will almost never happen when there is no rain, and rain will, for instance, will ground planes and will mean fewer people will be outside, so you have one issue. Second one, do you connect lightning strikes to locations of tweeters at all? Is a lightning strike in the north of Israel related to something that happens in Gaza? And the third question on that is, you have used self-reporting locations. Given that this is some of these are purposeful media campaigns, then you might have self-reporters, people who say they're in one or the other, who are not actually and are not affected by lightning strikes. And well, I have another question about the network maxima, that you took the daily, if I understood, the daily network maximum. So you could theoretically have an art where a single outraged article on one network is weighted equally to a network with many positive and negative articles. Though I think this last slide may be more about that. But like the single daily maxima is kind of question, like was.
All right, thanks very much. Yeah, you can hear me, right? Yeah, so there are actually 4 questions. So the first one about the whether the weather affects the attacks. Certainly, this is the case, but to the extent that we control very carefully for the strength of wind and rain, we think that probably is enough, precisely because that this is one thing which essentially affects the arms, because particularly for the Israeli attacks, they have all the technology to protect themselves from the discharges. But then you asked about the location of the lightning. So it turns out that the area is so small and the thunderstorms are so spatially correlated that we cannot separately estimate the effects of what's happening in North Israel on what's happening in the, in Gaza and stuff like this. Moreover, one thing is just the technical issue with the spatial correlation of thunderstorms, but the other issue is actually with the very important correlation of what's happening with Twitter on the other side of the conflict. Particularly when people tweet from Gaza, then there is immediate response from the Israelis, and that actually feeds into the loop. So actually, therefore, the outages in Gaza lead to different responses from the Israeli side and vice versa. So what we can do is just have a over time variation on how much of that activity is going on, but we cannot really single out other things. But it is true that we can predict bot activity separately. Not the conflict-related tweets, but the bots in Gaza are actually affected by lightnings and outages in Gaza, but not in Israel, and vice versa. But it's not true for the conflict-related stories. So the next question about the self-reported user profile, yes, you're right, but that's why we have instrument. So there are some tweets which come from somewhere else, and they claim to be from the conflict zone, but they certainly are not affected by our instrument. And the final point about what I haven't really talked about it much due to the problem of time, but indeed, in order to look at the tonality of coverage, we look at the most emotional broadcast by network during the day. And the reason for this is that there are actually very different types of broadcasts. So we just maximize variation by doing this, because when there are anchors who actually talk about their attitude to what's going on the ground, that's one thing. The other thing, when there's a reporter who just enumerates what's going on the ground. So we just help ourselves a little bit to maximize variation. We do have, although weaker, results on the just averages for everything.
Katya, we have one short question from Giacomo.
Yes, my short question, Katya, is related to these last slides, actually, and to what Hannes was asking. Would it be absurd in terms of the data requirement to look at coverage in some other country? Because, you know, you're saying this helps the underdog, but now, of course, the Palestinians are both the underdog in the actual fighting, sure, but they're also the side that the US public and media are normally less sympathetic to. And yes, I understand that this will be truer on the right than left, but I think that even, you know, the left wing of the Democratic Party is more sympathetic to Israel than the Palestinian, than like the median politician in Europe. And so, you know, if you could look at least at, I don't know, The Guardian, or, you know, ideally, but language becomes a problem probably there, you know, is it the case that in Arab countries you get some more sympathy for Israel when there's activity on social media? That would be huge, but, you know, I don't know whether you can do in the data, but it would be very sexy.
Yeah, so far we have Al Jazeera here, and I do not remember what happens with Al Jazeera if we interact with Israeli victims. So it's a very good point. I will look at that. As far as other traditional media are concerned, well, we need to get data for that, and it's not easy, but I guess it is not impossible, particularly for the online editions. But I think we should start thinking about your question, which is absolutely valid question, using an Al Jazeera variation, which we already have in hand. But I don't have a good answer now to this good question.
Thanks, Dominic, for inviting me and for organization of this fabulous conference that I'm very much enjoying. So I'm going to talk today about social media and xenophobia, evidence from Russia, and that's joint work with Leo Bustin, Georgy Yegorov, and Ruben Nikolopov. So probably I should not in this audience motivate our subject too much. In the recent years, the expressions of like hate and xenophobia increased quite a lot. What we do in this paper, we aim to study the role of social media, potential role of social media in this process. And we are trying to understand more broadly the formations of political opinions. So what we do? First of all, we are going to look at the impact of social media in Russia on ethnic attitudes and hate crime in 2007 to 2018. We conduct an experiment embedded in a survey in order to elicit the true attitudes. And we also measure stigma of expressing these attitudes. And finally, we develop a theoretical model to explain all of our findings together. So how social media can be related to hate crime and xenophobia. So first of all, social media can facilitate coordination of offline activities. And second, social media can affect directly people's opinion. And finally, social media can reduce stigma of expressing publicly xenophobic opinions. So what we find is that our evidence is consistent with coordination channel. So our evidence is also consistent with persuasion, but our evidence is not consistent with reduction of stigma. And okay, I have a suspicion that I'm using the wrong slides for this talk, but let me go on because we recently updated our results. In the worst case scenario, I'll exchange. So And we think that we contribute to the literature on social media. In the recent years, there's been papers on social media and polarization, protest, and even some papers on hate crime. How we contribute to this literature? First of all, we look at the impact of social media on xenophobic attitudes. We then study the long-term effects of social media on hate crime. And we provide a theoretical model to wrap this up together. Okay, and I'll probably skip that. So before I move on, I should explain you how we are going to approach our identification. For that, we have some, this is a slide on the history of social media in Russia. Russia is actually one of 5 countries in the world in which Facebook is not a dominant social media. Like they have their own social network called VK, which is very similar to Facebook in its functionality. And as Facebook was created by Mark Zuckerberg when he studied at Harvard, VK was created by Pavel Durov, who was then a student in St. Petersburg State University. And not surprisingly, the first users of VK were students from St. Petersburg State Universities who were coming from different cities. Many of them never returned to their home cities, but still they kept networks of friends and families who became early adopters. Okay, so this is one example of the community. This is quite xenophobic community that says that like skinheads, patriots, and all haters of like something that can't be pronounced in like aloud. Like I find it interesting that here one of the things that they discuss is that they were selling to each other the book of Adolf Hitler, Mein Kampf. So, and just for the illustration. Okay, so, and with this VK, what we do, we are going to use empirical strategy used in our earlier paper to study the impact on social media on protests. And we argue that this idiosyncratic variation in the distribution of who were the first users of VK could have very long effect on subsequent penetration of the network. And in particular, we use information on the city of origins of students who studied in St. Petersburg State University in the same years as the founder of VK. And we control for the cities of origins of students who studied several years before and several years later. And this is how it looks like. This is our first stage. And here you can see how that VK penetration in 2011, which is the midpoint of our study, is well related to the number of students from a city who studied in the same cohort as the founder of VK, but it was not related to either older or younger cohort. And this is essentially how our first stage looks like. So now, what we do next? First of all, we try to understand how social media in general affect xenophobia. And in particular, we want to answer whether social media can persuade people to have more xenophobic views, and whether social media can reduce stigma of expressing these xenophobic views. And to do this, we conducted a survey experiment in 125 Russian cities, and we pre-registered this, we did the pre-registration. And then we use the results of the survey to construct city-level measures of both ethnic hostility and stigma, and to relate it to social media penetration. And to maximize the power of the instrument, we are going to use two-sample 2SLS. Okay, so what we do? We did this survey. We included list experiment. We asked, like, I'll explain you, those of you who don't know what list experiment is, in the next slide. And the key question that we are asking is a question invented by Russian sociologist, and it says, like, do you feel annoyance or dislike toward some ethnicities, without specifying which particular ethnicities, because different people in Russia might feel dislike toward different ethnicities. So our problem, why do we need list experiment? Because, well, some people are not ready to openly answer this question, even if they have this opinion. So what we do, like, we ask them, what is the number of statements out of the following that you agree with? And some of these statements are pretty innocuous. For example, I'm worried about inflation, or I think that pensions could be increased, and so on. So we picked this statement so that we don't have the ceiling effect. Then control group gets only non-sensitive statements. Treatment group gets the same list of statements plus a sensitive statement. And then, like, we measure the number of people, the number of options that was chosen by people in control group, and we compare it with the number of options which was chosen on average in a treatment group. So by doing this, we cannot say for every particular person whether this person has chosen the sensitive option, but we can measure this, like, difference on average. So, so this city-level measure of xenophobia that we are going to use is just the difference at the city level between average difference between the number of people in control group who agree with the statement and the number of people in treatment group who agree with the statement. What we do, we create a city level measure of stigma. And here we also used some people in control group after the list experiment. We asked them directly the same sensitive question, potentially sensitive. Do you feel annoyance or dislike toward some ethnicities? And by comparing the number, like, hostility based on self-reported question and subtracting elicited hostility, we get a measure of stigma. Okay, this is how our results look like. Again, this is the city level regressions. You can see that on average, social media penetration led to higher levels of list experiment elicited hostility. And we also try to look at it separately by different groups, like male.
Can I interrupt you just to clarifying question? I didn't understand. So imagine that people all the time have no problem with answering the non-sensitive questions, but they systematically don't truthfully respond to the sensitive ones. I didn't understand, probably I was just too slow, how your approach would take care of that problem, which seems to me, if I had to say how people behave, pretty common suspicion, at least.
So like your question is whether like what would happen if all people don't report truthfully?
Well, not necessarily all, but systematically there is this tendency that, you know, if I'm asked a question, suppose I were a Trump supporter, if I'm asked a standard question, I give the answer. When it comes to that, I misrepresent my real views. It seems that to me is the #1 problem in capturing this type of
yeah, that's exactly the problem that LIST experiment is designed to solve. So originally it was invented to measure racism in the United States. So they offered several statements, including, and the sensitive statement was, would you be worried about Black family moving into your neighborhood? And then you ask about the number of statements that a person agrees with, right? Instead of particular statements. So like in direct question, people are feeling ashamed to say that, oh, like I'm worried about Black family moving in. But in indirect question, like here, I just need to say with how many statements I agree with. And here, like if on average, if you—
Now I got it. Now I got it. You can continue. Sorry, I understand what you've done. I didn't when you explained before. Now it's clear.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Like, this
sorry
is
about that. No, it's my fault.
Presentation, and I was too fast. Sorry. Okay, so here essentially what we find here is that first of all we see this positive effect of VK penetration on elicited hostility for the full sample, and this effect was especially strong for the group of young people who are presumably more likely to be persuadable. And this is consistent with basic persuasion story that social media persuades people to become more xenophobic. This is what happens if we relate social media penetration with stigma. So here the dependent variable should be stigma. So, and you can see that if anything, our measure of stigma goes up, not down. We see absolutely no evidence that there was a reduction of stigma following social media penetration. So we see that it for the full sample, and we see it also for subgroups of young, male, and those with low education. So in brief, of course, our measure is stigma vis-a-vis interviewers rather than like friends of these people. But at the same time, we find that our evidence is just not consistent with reduction of stigma of public expression of these xenophobic views. So now, as we show that social media led to increase in ethnic hostility, now we ask whether this increase actually translates to some more tangible outcomes. For that, we collected data on hate crime using data from Moscow-based NGO called SOVA. And these are violent crimes. It's not like verbal accusations or something like these are all violent crimes. And they aim to collect all hate crimes around Russia reported by either police or traditional media. And here they use the fact that there is special category of law whether this crime was conducted with motivation of ethnic hate. And that's special category of law. Okay, so before we move on, we also should highlight that given the literature, to which people in this room contributed quite a lot. There are reasons to believe that, like, to explain violent expression of xenophobia or extreme right voting, some initial predispositions also play a role. So what we do next, we are going to use a measure of nationalism, like vote share of openly nationalistic party Rodina in or motherland in 2003 election as a measure of pre-existing pre-social media nationalism. So here you can see, for example, that if we go to party manifesto projects, this was the only party in Russia which scored negative on the dimension of multiculturalism. And you can see that this measure is also very well correlated with number of hate crimes, ethnic hate crime, especially ethnic hate crimes, and some like self-reported attitudes. Okay, so this is our main result for this part. Here we look at the impact of social media on hate crime, and we interact social media penetration with a measure of pre-existing nationalism. And you can see that, like, what our results suggest, that in places which like were previously tolerant, there is no effect of social media on hate crime. But in places in which there was already high level of pre-existing nationalism, there is a positive and very significant effect of social media on hate crime. And it's true for both hate crimes committed by single perpetrators and by multiple perpetrators, for ethnic hate crime and for non-ethnic hate crime. So our evidence strongly suggests that social media indeed affects hate crime. Okay, so just to give you some interpretation, the effect of 10% increase in social media penetration led to no effect on the number of hate crime in the cities with minimum support of nationalistic party, but 25% higher hate crime in cities with maximum support of nationalistic party. So what we get so far? First, social media led to more increase in inferred ethnic hostilities, which is like that social media had some persuasion power over people's opinion. Second, social media increased rather than decreased stigma of public expressions of xenophobia. And finally, social media had an effect on hate crime, but it was only working in places with high levels of pre-existing nationalism. And these effects are stronger for crimes conducted by multiple perpetrators, which suggests that some coordination also played a role. Okay, so now let me try to be super quick about our theoretical part. We need a model that predicts that social media led to more hate crime and more hostility, like more ethnic hostility. At the same time, we want the model to explain why we have stronger effect of social media on hate crime, but not necessarily in places with pre-existing nationalism, but not necessarily stronger hostility in places with more pre-existing nationalism. And at the same time, openly expressing hostility does not become more socially acceptable. So we use very simple opinion dynamic model. So there is nothing complicated here. So here, essentially, my new position depends on my old position and on the position of other individuals. So I take position other individuals with some weight, in which the share tau of people are exactly like me, and the share of 1 minus tau are different, like random individuals. And we assume that tau proxies for social media penetration here, in the sense that I'm more likely to meet individuals like me on social media as compared with the absence of social media. So, like, this is a dynamic process, and essentially for any initial distribution, we see some convergence of this distribution to a normal distribution, and then the variance of this distribution depends on our parameters. How much weight do I put on my own opinion, social media penetration, and the original variance of the shock. And here, essentially, from the way we constructed this, it immediately follows that social media increases polarization. And you will see that, in particular, in our setting, that can quite easily explain, like, all of our results together. If we put, like, if our main opinion axis is tolerance towards xenophobia, so we, like, argue that people who commit hate crimes, they need very high threshold for xenophobia, while admitting publicly annoyance or dislike towards some ethnicity needs some other type of the threshold. And this is essentially the summary of our result. If, like, so what's going on with when social media arrives, the distribution becomes now has fatter tails, and with low pre-existing level of nationalism, we see that this increase in the number of people who commit hate crime is sizable, like, but maybe it's quite low. While with high pre-existing levels of nationalism, it becomes much larger. So that's essentially the logic of the model. So let me stop here. What we think our paper showed is that social media led to increase in xenophobia and increase in hate crime. And we find evidence that, if anything, social media increased rather than reduced stigma of publicly expressing xenophobic views. And our results are consistent with social media increasing polarization, but at the same time not making society more hateful. Okay, so I stop. I'll be happy to answer questions.
Maria, if I can't see a question at the moment, so maybe let me ask one myself. So what do you think about, like, liberal progressive causes? So do you I mean, your model predicts polarization. So do you think that if you were to study something with, like, progressive ideas, would you find something similar? You think? I mean, that would also be interesting, right? I guess.
So we think that it could be similar in some way, but of course the thresholds, like, here we operationalized having hate crime as having, for example, super high levels of xenophobia. So here, like, it depends on the attitudes that you look, but I think that in principle our model could be used to study the relationship, just generally formation of political opinions.
Hannes has a question as well.
Yeah, thank you. So I think it's of course you have this super cool identification strategy and rely on this kind of city variation. And I was wondering whether you could use more the time variation interacted with this city variation, in the sense of like maybe there is things that are uniting people and that kind of go against this polarization effect. You know, maybe there's something on, I don't know, maybe the Crimea War is the wrong example because it's also a very nationalistic moment, but I was wondering whether, you know, you can look at time variation in hate crimes and see whether social media is used differently in different times. Does that at all sound useful to you? Or, I mean, I think it would be interesting to think about useful time variation in the way that social media is used, and think about.
So, yeah, that's an excellent question. So we try to look at we cannot do survey experiment back in time, of course, but we looked at the relationship between social media and the hate crime by period. And we find that the effect was mostly driven by earlier periods.
I see, okay.
Here we have we have a confounding factor, because like after 2011, after the protests, so in Russia, they adopted some new laws, and they which aimed to to regulate the activity of the opposition, but also because it was done under the pretext of like hiding extremism. As a byproduct, they also closed a lot of extremist communities in VK. So,
wow. Okay.
So we think that that could be one of the explanations why we don't see the effect for late period.
Yeah, thank you.
So Maria, I don't know, I have my hand up, but I'll just speak. So thank you, super interesting. I wanted to maybe understand a bit better the stigma result, because, so my understanding is it's a difference between the true level of hate, which is the elicited one in the experiment, and the self-reported one, right? So I would assume this variable to always be positive because people report less hate than they actually have. So when you say that stigma goes up, we know that the true level went up because you showed us a result on that, right? So the outcome related to the experiment, is it correct that it goes up at the city level? So the first term in this difference is going up. And then when you say stigma goes up, is it just because the second term, that is the self-reported, stays constant? Let's say I never admit to hate crime, that has nowhere to go. It's enough for the elicited level to increase and stigma will increase. Or is it that people actually become more self-conscious in admitting it, and so self-reported would even go down? Because when you say stigma goes up, my intuition is more like people having more trouble revealing openly, but this result you have could also be mechanically generated by this willingness to reveal staying constant, and just the elicited level going up. And I agree that the bottom line is that the gap between the two measures increases, but I think having the two component and understanding what's happening on both sides might also be interesting.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So we looked at this, of course, and we did not find any significant effect. So if you just put reported on the left-hand side, then you don't see any effect. And moreover, this result, this is the only result that we can replicate with earlier, much larger survey. Because back in 2011, there was a survey which asked precisely these questions for approximately 30,000 respondents. So, and because of the sample size, this was more precise. And the effect is the same, so which is no effect. Like we find zero effect for the effect social media on self-reported ethnic attitudes. So it's only when we use this list experiment that we see the difference. So that also highlights importance of using these methods in social science more, like as the recent kind of elections suggested that maybe there are some silent Trump voters, at least in some states, that like were not showing up in surveys. Yeah.
So can I jump? I really just wanted. It can be a mechanical effect, but it's actually, but at least it's not driven by the fact that, you know, like nobody admits this, and it's like sealed at zero. There are like more than 30% of people who openly admit that they don't like other ethnicities. So it's maybe that it stays constant, but at least it's not because of this mechanical effects. So there's something else going on. Sorry to jump in.
No, why? Thanks, Ruben. Thanks for helping me.
What are the relevant racial lines in Russia? I mean, who are like what is the big, I mean, who are people xenophobic against? And do you have cities where this is a more, you know, where there's more 50-50 mixes, or like, can you look at like polarization at the city level? Is this something relevant that you could look into?
Oh, so in Russia is a large country, so they are xenophobic against many different nationalities. In some places, they still don't like Jews. In some places, they don't like people from Central Asia. In some places, they don't like people from North Caucasus. So, like, there are all sorts of people that whom they don't like. And well, I'm not sure. Like, I think that in most places it's less than 50-50, but I think that we tried to exclude some places with a lot of, you know, like national, like republics, national republics in which they have non-Russians as a dominant group, and our results go through.
I think, like, sorry, again, like in these surveys, they don't specify the ethnic group that you don't like, but in ethnic crimes, we know the nationality of the people being attacked. By far, the most likely to be attacked are people from Central Asia, from the 5 republics out there, who come as they are more like, you know, like Mexicans in the US. They are migrants. Who come working in Russia, and the second place are people from northern, from Caucasian republics, actually not non-Russian, mostly like the real republic, Armenia, Georgia, and Azerbaijan, and by implication, all the people like from northern Caucasian republics. So they are the second one. So it's basically among the ethnicities that are actually have large proportions in Russia itself, it's only these northern Caucasian republics that are represented, and we tried, like, if you drop them completely, nothing changes basically there.
No, I wasn't testing robustness. I was really just like asking, like, you know, for example, in Germany, it tends, I don't know, this is my perception, and I think it's backed up by surveys, that in places where actually there are a lot of foreigners, xenophobia isn't surprisingly that high. And then you have these places where there's actually very few. There seems to be some tipping point where people are really xenophobic in places where there are actually not that many around, and more xenophobic when there are few around. I just wanted to know whether, you know, you were thinking about this, like what is the mixture that really leads to this maximum xenophobia problem?
That's a great idea. Here, the problem is that in Russia we don't have good data about this labor migrants.
Yeah, of course.
So we know the ethnic composition of people who live in these cities, but not a good estimates of the labor migrants, and they seem to be the main driving group. So it's that's the problem with the data availability.
But I mean, I would be surprised if Moscow, for example, was like a hotspot of xenophobia.
Yes, but we exclude Moscow. You know, like whenever we study Russia, we exclude Moscow because there's Moscow and there's Russia, and they're like completely like different world. So Moscow and St. Petersburg are not in the SAP.
So this paper is called Ballot or Bullet. It's the impact of UK's representation of the People Act on Peace and Prosperity. Joint work with Alessandro Saya here. Alessandro will answer some questions in the chat. So if you have technical questions or short questions, please go for the chat. And otherwise, like the big philosophical debate, if you want, we can all have together later on at like in 25 minutes. So let's have a look at this quote by Malcolm X. This is why I say it's the ballot or the bullet. It's liberty or it's death. It's freedom for everybody or freedom for nobody. And so what he means by this quote, I guess, is that there's no other way to have lasting peace than to go for democracy. As long as you not have full democracy, it will be hard to avoid unrest. Let's have another quote by a famous historian, Gertrude Himmelfarb, and here on the picture you see Queen Victoria. The Reform Act of 1867 was one of the decisive events, perhaps the decisive event in modern English history. It was this act that transformed England into a democracy. And so this is the Reform Act that we're going to study. And it's really a milestone of the history of democracy, because it was the decisive event for England, and England, being the leading superpower at that time, was kind of inspiring a whole range of other democratizing countries. And so what is the situation today? So what is kind of, in what context do we study this question today? Well, democracy is under stress, as you all know. So if you look at Freedom House Index, for example, a bit less than half of the countries are free, like UK, Switzerland, France, etc. As 30% are partially free, like with rigged elections, but still some elections, and the rest are kind of full dictatorships, autocracies. The overall democracy scores of the world, if you look at Polity4 scores, for example, have been on the decline for the 13th consecutive year. So for the last dozen years, every year, on average, some more countries have left the club of democracies than joined it. And the rising Chinese superpower is seen increasingly as an alternative role model for democracy. So when you talk with people from countries that are kind of hesitating among systems, very often you hear that the Chinese regime has quite a lot of soft power, and democracies are perceived to have several troubles. And maybe the last US election didn't help. So, well, then the question is, in this situation where the democracy is on the defense, even sometimes on the decline, well, we should ask ourselves, well, what was the reason, the raison d'être of democracy to start with? Why the heck were we interested in democracy to begin with? And maybe this tells us something about the merits of democracy still today. Well, if you start with the dominant theory on this topic by Acemoglu Robinson, democracy is a commitment device, and in this way it allows to buy off protesters that have de facto political power in a given period, and by having credible transfers through democracy, by transferring de jure political power, democracy is a way to curb unrest, and that's what it is about. So in their theory, democracy is about avoiding bloodshed. There is another theory that sadly has received way less attention. It's by Jeremy Laurent Luchetti, Matthias Tönig, and me. And their democracy in our paper, we see it as a way to reduce asymmetric information, where elections convey some useful information that then can inform about political strengths and military strengths of opponents, and will allow for smoother bargaining. And however, when it comes to the raison d'être of democracy, our conclusion is similar than for the Acemoglu Robinson. We also have the same prediction, basically, that democracy curbs unrest. So the fact that this is like a key prediction of democracy, really the rationale why we care about democracy to start with, at least part of why we care about democracy to start with, is that it's promised to curb violence and political unrest. Now, the problem is that we don't have that much evidence on that so far, and we don't know much about the mechanisms at work. And that's where this paper comes in, and that's our goal here. So what we do is we study the impact of the enfranchisement following the UK Second Reform Act of 1867 on political unrest. What we do is we exploit arguably exogenous variation in the extent of franchise extension, and we carry out a different IV analysis. We had to, for this purpose, we had to collect our own conflict data, drawing on information from over 230,000 newspaper articles from 471 UK newspapers. And so we created a panel data set covering 184 cities over 24 months, resulting in 4,416 observations. We study, third, we study potential channels of transmission, looking at public spending, political competition, local economic growth. So what do we find? Well, we find a strong pacifying effect of enfranchisement. The average franchise extension in this reform was kind of massive, so it almost doubled the electorate. And this extension of the franchise of 89% on average, according to our estimates, reduced conflict by 40% of the baseline risk. So the baseline risk was roughly 20%. So in 20% of a given month's city, there was conflict, and after the reform, this dropped to roughly 10%. So it went from a fifth to a tenth in terms of risk. So big effect. In terms of mechanisms, we don't detect an effect on public spending, and I say a few words on why this could be. We detect a small effect on increased competitiveness of UK politics, and one of the major channels that we see is that franchise extension boosts local economic growth. So the channel that we see here is that after franchise extension would go along with having a bigger local economic growth, and by kind of creating a more favorable economic environment, this would tend to curb conflict, which is also in line with the recent paper of Acemoglu and co-authors that's on a worldwide scale. They make the claim, at least, that democracy causes economic growth. And so, yeah, so to come back to the China soft power thing of before, basically what we're saying is that, well, at least for this famous UK milestone, we find indeed that democracy would kind of do well politically in terms of curbing conflict, and it would also do well economically. And so basically, you know, when you see the argument of people saying, well, let's go down the Chinese path. If you compare China with India, India is a democracy, but is outperformed economically by China. Well, then I understand that there are big countries, but still there are two data points. If you look at the whole country, the whole panel of countries, as Acemoglu did, you find that democracies do better. And here in our much narrower setting, with much more fine-grained data, we also actually find that democracies would do well economically. Okay, so in terms of literature, I'll have to skip this slide in the interest of time. But basically, our contributions here is that it's a novel study of very large scale, arguably exogenous franchise extension on political conflict, like the big milestone reform in the UK. And we construct a new data set on this, and we study the mechanisms at work. So let me talk about the historical context. The Victorian Age of Reform. The 19th century is often referred to as the British Age of Reform, with a series of franchise extension making politics increasingly inclusive. The first big reform was in 1832. It's called the First Reform Act. And there, basically, the aristocracy kind of shared power with the middle class, so that the big bourgeois, wealthy citizens would also be able to access the right to vote. And one goal of that reform was to appease the violent popular demands and riots for extension of suffrage. But it didn't really, it curbed maybe a bit the violence, but it didn't fully curb violence. There was still kind of quite a bit of violence, of demands, of protestations to get more political inclusion in the following years. And so the elite had to kind of further extend the franchise to also get the working class on board. So in this initial reform, basically what the elites did, because they were very scared of kind of populist democracy, of kind of a tyranny of the majority and these kind of things. Well, what the elites did, they built in some safeguard saying that you would only be able to vote if your housing property was worth at least £10 renting value. And that was a lot of money at that time. And which would mean that only if you lived very comfortably in a nice mansion, you would be able to vote. So it would keep the working class out, but only include the middle class. Then when riots still continued, then there was a bipartisan reform, the Second Reform Act of 1867, that was then decided. And there, for the first time, the urban male working class in England and Wales was also enfranchised. And so this reform abolished the £10 per year housing qualification, and everybody could vote, as every urban male could vote as long as they paid the so-called poor rates, some basic taxes. But if you were very poor, then you would obviously not pay taxes. So the kind of, there was still some implicit threshold because you had to be somewhat well off to pay taxes, and this threshold would correspond roughly around £4 housing value. So to put it simply, the threshold went down from £10 to £4. But this led to doubling basically of the voter base. So you see here graphically in the first Reform Act, increased by a quarter roughly the voters. Then there were smaller reformlets, and then the big Second Reform Act would almost double the number of voters. Here you see each city in our sample is a dot. So as I was saying, we have 184 cities. We have a panel of 184 cities over these 24 months. If we had time, we could count the dots together, but we would end up with 184. In terms of data on conflict, we've constructed a novel conflict data set. Obviously, we cannot take ACLED and UCDP, GEDELT, etc. off the shelf for this time period. So we had to start from scratch. So we looked at 230,000 newspaper articles containing at least one conflict-related keyword. And that's from the National Newspaper Archive, with this covering 471 national and local newspapers, and many of them are still household names. So like London Evening Standard, the Sun, the Scotsman, etc. would still be in this data. And so from these newspaper articles, with a back of words approach, we came up with this measure of violence at the city month level. And then so that's our main measure that is very easy to understand. But then we have some robustness check where we do a lasso approach with deep learning, where we further refine the approach, but we find basically the same results. So yeah, so here you see the dots with light colors indicate cities with fewer conflicts in the post period. Data on elections. So here, okay, how I'm doing on time. Data on elections. So the main explanatory variable is the number of enfranchised citizens. And the moment when they first were enfranchised was when they could vote at the 1868 election. So basically, we quote the 12 months before the election as still having the old representation, and then the 12 months after the election as having the new enfranchised representation. We will instrument for the number of, so first we do a diff in diff, and then we will instrument for the number of newly enfranchised voters after the reform, exploiting idiosyncratic variation at the city level of the structure of rents paid. So basically what happens is that we want to see whether, you know, controlling for the average rents, controlling for the inequality in rents, we can also control for plenty of other things. Controlling for these things, we kind of, our instrument boils down to comparing places where for some idiosyncratic reasons, there was a bit more mass right below the threshold of 10 and more people got enfranchised than having a bit more mass above 10 and those people could vote already before and fewer got enfranchised. And here you see, again, darker colors means higher enfranchisement. Here. So I skip the descriptive statistics. I straightly go to the first just illustrative bin scatter graph. So each dot here would represent obviously various cities. And here you see this negative correlation with basically less enfranchisement correlating with more violence and more enfranchisement with less violence. But now we obviously want to go beyond this correlation and we want to run some regression. So, okay, so let me carry on. So basically, what is the regression that we run? On the left-hand side, we have social violence, which is again here a 0-1 dummy, but we get similar results when we used intensive margin as well. But here it's a 0-1 dummy at the month's city level of whether there has been one violent riot. And our variable of interest is the interaction of the enfranchisement, which is just a one-off event. So it only varies, it's not time varying, it varies just at the city level, interacted with the month where this is taking place. So it's a general diff in diff, if you like. We have fixed effects at the city level, fixed effects at the month level. And the change in electorate represents the evolution of the electorate pre and after the Reform Act. So it's the log of electors post-reform over electors pre-reform. Yeah, we cluster standard errors and I skip the other details in the interest of time. And then what we do is we instrument this. So what we instrument is the change in the electorate, and we instrument it with the change in householders that are eligible to vote given their value of the house they occupy. And there, what's obviously crucial for the exclusion restriction is that we control for the average rents in the city and for the Gini of the rents, of how unequal they are. And we have in the appendix robustness checks where we would control for various other moments or other facets of this. But basically the idea is that for the same level of average rents, the same level of inequality in rents, you have this idiosyncratic variation, meaning that some places get a bit more enfranchised than others. In terms of instrument strengths, we have a high F-stat, and here you see graphically that really the eligible householders on the horizontal axis and the change in electorate on the vertical axis are very strongly correlated. But interestingly, they are only correlated for this period where we expect them to be correlated. For other periods where this 10 and 4 pound threshold should not matter, there we don't see anything. It's just a flat correlation. So, which is kind of reassuring that it doesn't pick up something else. So let me talk you through the main results. So here in the first 3 columns, we just have the normal OLS diff in diff. And so there what we see, what we see in the what we see in our variable of interest, it has a coefficient of 0.1 roughly, which means that basically, as I was saying, and the sample mean was 0.22. So basically, having a doubling of the electorate would reduce by roughly 40% a bit more than 40% the risk of conflict, from 20% risk to 10% risk, and the reform on average was kind of doubling. So we see a really big effect. Then in the columns 4 to 6, we have the reduced form where we directly use the instrument to predict. And then we have the 2SLS, where again, as explained before, we see the coefficients are a bit bigger, but quite similar, and which could reflect measurement error, for example. So then we do plenty of robustness checks, but I'll not have time to go through them in detail. So we control for various socio-demographic controls, alternative instruments, intensive margin, synthetic control methods, lotsheets, spatial clustering, dropping one city at a time, dropping one newspaper at a time, alternative time frequencies at the weekly level, then the post and pre-reform simply collapse, placebo analysis, where we look at sports events, where we look at sports event instead of violent events. We wouldn't expect anything, we don't find anything. Then for data construction, alternative keywords, machine learning. And we also have a robustness check that we kind of like, where we would only look at events that are covered by bigger newspapers far away, to make sure that we don't pick up the little local pub row. And the results are, if anything, stronger if we do that. So I'm happy to go back to that, but I'm a bit worried that otherwise I won't be able to finish on time. And I know that Uwe is tough. I've experienced that in the past. So let me move forward. So we don't detect any increase in state. So then we look at what are the channels. So what is happening? What is kind of what is triggered by this enfranchisement? We don't see any change in public spending or in kind of political influence at the national level as measured by political speeches. So there again, we collect new data for looking at that. The reason that we cannot find an effect on public spending may just be that our time frame is a bit short, right? If for example, places that are enfranchised would kind of put in place policies that are more in the interest of the population, like building local schools and stuff, well, that may take some years. So there may well be some effect on increasing state capacity and public spending after democratization, but it's just maybe our sample is too short to cover it. So we don't claim that it's not there, but we just don't see it. However, what we see is that elections become more competitive and that the local economic activity is boosted. And so let me show you a few results on that. So what we see is that here, what we have here is that on the right-hand side, we have a change in electorate. And on the left-hand side, we have a change in the number of voters. What we see is that if you increase the electorate, the number of voters increases a bit more than proportionally. And we also have some feeble kind of borderline significant results on turnout, that also turnout goes up a little bit. But this is enough to make elections more competitive. So UK is kind of maybe infamous for having some secure seats where for decades always conservatives win or always Labour win. And politicians don't have to be super reactive to their constituents. While here what we see is actually now with this reform, it went up. There's a big increase in contested elections where actually politicians need to be responsive to their constituents in order to have good re-election prospects. Then let me say a few words on local economic growth. Obviously, again, we cannot just take Penn World Table for that time period. So we have to to create our own local economic growth measures. What we do is we look again at the newspaper archive, and we look at job ads, starting with the word wanted. And so basically what this means is that if in Sheffield there are plenty of job ads now, we would expect that this may mean that there is a bigger economic boom than if, for example, in York there are way fewer job ads. And we see that our variables, the same right-hand side variables as in the baseline regressions, if we regress them on city mentions in newspaper ads, so how many job ads are there in Sheffield or Bristol or Birmingham, we see that actually this we find this strong positive coefficient. And so let me just give a few illustration of counterfactual reforms. So what happened in the reform that we look at is this threshold for being able to vote would go down from £10 to £4. So what we observe is our baseline is the red bar here, which would reduce violence by 10 percentage points, so minus 0.10, right? That's if you go down from 10 to 4. What would have happened if they had only go down to 8? Well, that's what you see here. Then the effect would have been much more dismal, like 2 percentage points. And if they had been more generous, like enfranchising everybody, then the effect would have been even bigger, like 13, so 13 percentage points. However, if they had become more elitist and excluding more people, then actually social violence would have gone up, according to these simulations. And actually, in the paper we talk, so the paper is on our website, it's a CEPR working paper. In the paper, we talk quite a bit about actual reforms that were on the table. And some of them were elitist, where some of the elite was pushing for making politics less open and less inclusive. And what we say here is that this would have actually increased the level of violence. For economic activity, we see something kind of similar, where the reform that really took place is in red. If they had been more generous, growth would have been bigger. If they had been more elitist, growth would have been smaller. So let me maybe wrap up here. Okay, thanks for your attention.
Oh, thanks a lot. And the floor is open for discussion.
Dominic, super fascinating work. All sounds very plausible. Can you give us a couple of examples of what kind of violence is actually in your data set? Because, you know, the second half of the 19th century, Victorian England is not exactly a hotbed of social unrest. So the first half can be quite rough. The second half we tend to think of as extremely placid waters. So what is the social violence? Is it the bag of the tea lady being snatched, or is it something more exciting?
No, so it's I mean one of the worries was, well, let me maybe give you first a qualitative answer, and then let me show you one more graph. So it's not the bag of the lady. So basically, so we read a bit about it, and it's true that like the Murphy riots, for example, took still place quite a bit at this time period, and there were quite a bit of riots, a lot of rivalry between Irish origin working class and English origin working class, and the Irish origin working class were kind of they were so there was a lot of violence involving Irish English kind of ethnic division, if you like, Catholic Protestants, and many of the people who got enfranchised were part of this Irish origin working class. And after this enfranchisement, this violence dropped quite substantially. We have some results that I didn't have time to show here that are in the paper, that we see that in places that were very polarized Irish English, that the results get actually magnified. And maybe just to show you very quickly the results, what happens if we only focus on distant events in newspaper. So again, we were worried about what you called the lady with the tea bag, and I was what we would call, you know, the fighting in the pub and stuff. And so what we do there is that what we first here what you see is that in the baseline, in the first column, we only we include our baseline. We include all the like that's here we reproduce simply the baseline, and then in the second column we only include events that have been covered by newspapers that are located at least 50 kilometers away. So something happening in Liverpool, but that is kind of covered in a Manchester evening news or something. And then we go even more extreme, 100 kilometer, 150, 200 kilometer, etc. So something happening in York is only counted as conflict if it gets covered, for example, in London. And what we see is that obviously then fewer conflicts get covered. So the sample mean, if you look, it goes down because we are much more selective, but the coefficient go down less. So compared to the sample mean, the results get, if anything, stronger. Maybe Alessandro, you want to also chip in, because you know, usually you give good answers as well. Alessandro?
Yeah, so just a couple of points.
Yeah.
Just a couple of points. So here, so an interesting question is how big are these events? And the second one is which type of violence is. So this exercise is fairly simple and is based just in terms of coverage. If you are far away, then it's less likely to cover a small event. And what, of course, this is not very, I mean, it's very robust. And if you try to compute the effect, so if you compare the point estimate with the sample mean across the different columns, you can see that actually the column on the right, so the cover where the coverage is more far away, deliver bigger effect. And on top of that, what we have an exercise where we ask to an array to read the conflict event, so the sentences that we detected, in order to see how many good how many false positives we detected. And actually, the goodness of our exercise is very high. 86% of the time that we detect an event, there is actual an event. And so when we try to refine our algorithm using machine learning techniques based on these training set of articles, actually results are very similar, if anything, are even robust. And of course, I mean, there are a couple of good points, and we will try to address most of them. The issue that I can say is that sometimes it's difficult to pin down exactly the cause of conflict because of the scarce information that is provided in the newspaper, or because probably, you know, also the reading of the newspaper is kind of difficult because in terms of, you know, digitalization, the effort done by the British newspaper archive is exceptional, but I mean, still, these are newspapers that are 150 years old.
So there are some more questions, and so maybe let's take Hannes and Giacomo, but Uwe is the boss, and Joachim, we can chat more if you like afterwards. Thanks a lot.
Okay, I have two comments, and that relate much more to your motivation than actually to your actual results. And the first one is more a comment, namely that I think democracy is more than just elections, and I think it's important to stress that. No, it's also the checks and balances part, and I think the US is a fantastic example of functioning democracy in that regard. My second question is also related to the motivation you're giving, namely that it's good for growth, and you're kind of comparing your results to the cross-country data. But of course, here within country, you have these time-fixed effects that cover like redistributive effects, right? So it could just be that what's happening is that more resources flow relatively to those cities where more people got elections, right? So it's not necessarily it's good for growth, but it's, you know, good for relative growth within the same country. And I think this is an important difference, right? Because across countries it's a bit harder to think about this.
So we have an exercise where we look at that. So let me maybe again say a few words and then hand over to Alessandro for the more further points. So we look at we look at how often a given place was mentioned in political speeches, right? So for example, is it like that if Sheffield enfranchised a lot, that Sheffield now gets mentions much more in political speeches, may also get much more pork barrel spending, and this may kind of drive up the job ads. And we don't find that. So we don't detect that here actually. Again, it may be that our measure is crude, but we don't see this effect here. Alessandro, if you want to chip in, maybe.
So and the same effect, we detect the same effect when we use raw newspaper data. So if in the newspaper, how many times, not in political speeches, but just in newspaper, how many times the city is going to mention in the newspaper, and we use the same type of structure, we don't detect any type of effect. And we also have that can be related to your point, an exercise with the sport events in order to see if we detect something that is peculiar with the city and the time. And with the placebo effect, we don't detect any type of effect. If anything, the point estimates are really close to zero, even though the sample mean is fairly similar.
So maybe we don't have so much more time, right? There was Giacomo having a comment, and Chris. So, but who will we?
Yeah, let's go quick. So we have now we're just at 35 minutes, so I think we can have a couple of more minutes.
So a quick question on the meaning on the lines of Hannes. So I was wondering whether you have any data on repression, because I think that what this is showing, which I am persuaded by, is that, you know, having a halfway democracy is a problem because the people you're excluding are going to create trouble. But I'm not sure that it quite speaks about the Chinese model, where nobody gets to vote for the government, and repression is quite stark. And I wonder whether there's any variation in, you know, are there any places in Britain that are cracking down hard? And can you look that, well, in that case, the benefit is not as strong?
So I think this is a very interesting point. So you know, if you look at the cross-country regressions in pooled panels, for example, Buhaug and Hegre, etc., they have some famous paper in the American Political Science Review 20 years ago. And what they do is what they find, but it's again it's a pooled panel, so it's hard to interpret the results. So they're comparing basically Somalia with Finland and Sudan with Norway. But basically what they see is that they find an inverted U shape. So they find that if you're a hardcore dictatorship, then people are just too scared to do anything, and it's very stable, but in a very negative way. While full democracies also hardly ever see conflict. And in the middle ground, if you have some incomplete democracy, then you see conflict. And that's already what we saw with the French Revolution, right? When if things go from bad to a bit better, then the revolution happened. So I guess one interpretation of our results would be that maybe the UK before the Reform Act was an incomplete democracy, and then it moved towards a full democracy. While our predictions on opening up full autocracy may be on the left hand side of the inverted U shape. Right? It's a good point. Yeah, maybe if I take Chris' point, maybe Alessandro, I just try to.
I wrote my. I just wanted to ask a follow up on my question about why it wouldn't be unrest causing growth rather than growth causing or reducing unrest. But I don't think it's important. Mostly your 3% battery is making me nervous that we're going to lose you. You should really plug in your computer.
Yes, no. My computer is it is plugged in, but yeah, it already crashed once today.
As long as we don't lose you in the middle of you talking, I'm happy.
Yeah, no, I was scared about that. But Alessandro, if you want to say like 2 sentences
I had a little bit of problem in following the sentences and reading the questions. So I was a little bit lost on the last part because there were a couple of good questions related to the public spending and technical questions related on the data. So I lost the last 2 minutes of the discussion. Sorry about that.
So basically the question of Chris was about the causality. How can we say that growth is the channel and is not democracy the channel for growth?
Yeah, I mean, as I wrote, excellent question. We have an exercise where we try to convince the readers that actually the story goes, you have democracy and then because of, you have democracy and then you have an increase in public spending and then you have growth. And in order to convince Chris or whatever, we try to predict the increase in newspaper ads using data on cities that have a similar level of enfranchisement. And then we regress this predicted newspaper growth, job ads growth on the newspaper, on the violence-based variable. And we observe this negative correlation. The higher the predicted newspaper ads, the lower the conflict events that we observe in the city month.
I think it'd actually be more. I mean, I don't know that's very convincing. I think if you could find evidence of the opposite, it would be more original and more interesting. If there's investment data, you might see some responsiveness around expectations of lower unrest and therefore more investment, and that would be a pretty big contribution.
Something you could do with your data, which I think is also, one of the important claims in this literature on enfranchisement, and only in the UK can you really do it, is to look at volunteering in World War I. Right? So there's a big literature on what gets people to fight for their country and having a stake in it, being part of the democratic process. One of the reasons why we might want to extend the franchise, some people claim, is actually that you get, in the age of mass armies, labor for free. So Britain has volunteering in contrast to almost everybody else until 1916. And you have geographical variation in the extent to which people become enfranchised in 2 big steps. So a very natural way to sort of use the data on the right-hand side that you already have would be just to grab this data on volunteering and marry it with your exercise, which is not quite the same thing. I think it's conceptually distinct, but it's sort of the logical continuation of what you're trying to say. It says, people have a stake in this society, and it's not just that they stop trying to undermine it and throw dirt and riot, but they're even going as far as to want to invest, their own blood, sweat, and tears in making it a success.
Mm-hmm. I think that's an interesting, very interesting idea, super idea. So let's talk more about that, Joachim.
I have the data. I can.
Yeah. No, that would be super. And there are not so many papers on this topic, in a sense. Do you have a paper on the New Deal and
social security and welfare spending and volunteering? Exactly. Yeah. So for the US, you can do it too, not because they do a great deal of volunteering. You should get rid of it very quickly, but there's a small window when you can actually do it.
Is there potentially also variation within the UK in terms of checks and balances of some specific local institutions that you could use? Because of course, democracy is not only elections and participation, but also, what type of checks and balances there
are. We would have to look into it. I mean, the country is fairly centralized. I mean, compared to a country like Switzerland, the UK is relatively centralized, right?
Right.
But it's a good point. We should investigate this.
Can I ask a stupid, probably question based on my ignorance? Could it be the case that the Reform Act itself was a response to violence, like in some way? like that it was one of its goals, and therefore it could come at the same time with some other policies which could be used to fight the same problem.
Well, that's a little bit the Acemoglu argument, no? This is what Toke and Ait argue for the 1832 case, that when everybody sees the scale of the violence in the swing riots, there's more willingness to extend the franchise, which for 1832 is very strange, because the people who get the vote are definitely not the ones who do the rioting. They will be the ones with a large house and a coach and servants. But for that context, the argument has been made. But here, I think it would be much more plausible.
In the paper, what we try to do, we look at the reduced form of our instrument and the election time before and after the passage of the Second Reform Act. So the election of 65 and then the election of 72. So we are talking about elections that are 3 years before and 3 years after, and we don't detect any effect. And so remember that our instrument, that is this delta in the householders above and below 10 pounds, predicts really well the delta electorate that then we observe. So I think that yes, it's a valid concern, is a well taken point, but we have an exercise in the paper where we try to rule out that this was the case.
So thanks a lot, Dominic, for asking me to rush to present something, and what I have to present is joint work with Mario and with Rudi, and it's really incomplete, where we just managed to bring together the slides. So all the comments that you might have will be particularly welcome now. So the paper is on, or the project is on, political polarization, the perception of reality and social unrest. And what we mean by that is the observation that if you think about preferences for politics and preferences for parties, well, this is all beyond what we typically teach in political economy at the beginning, where everything is about material interests. It becomes more and more clear that ideology, partisanship, and polarization along ideology lines becomes extremely important. And the example in case is, of course, the US, where all of a sudden, at least it seems, the party divisions, they dominate everything. They dominate the voting outcomes, the adherence to political decisions, but they go much beyond. So they are extremely influential. And you see that in a wave of papers that are coming out and that are investigating, so what do shocks like wildfire burnings in California do to pro-environmental attitudes? And it looks like, well, it only changes part of the electorate attitude. So it changes one party adherence preferences for particular policies, but not the other ones. And it looks like that this is very much rooted in partisanship reasons. And you see the same thing for the COVID pandemic, for social distancing. You see it even in everyday economic behavior. If you start playing games in the lab, that's the work by McConnell. And you see it if you look at expectations. All these things seem to be influenced a lot by partisanship and political polarization. Now, on a next level, what determines that? Well, it starts becoming clearer and clearer that ideology is even self-enforcing. And what we mean by that is, well, so if you are adhering to a particular party or political standpoint, you not only vote differently on particular subjects, but you also make different decisions about the acquisitions of corrective information. So you might even say, well, I don't even want to know any information that is contradicting some of my standpoints. And it also seems that parties, and this is very new evidence from Denmark, that parties affect, political opinions. And if parties themselves change their position on a particular policy, that even affects the people down on the micro level, and what people think about these parties. So it's really ideology that is in some sense perpetuating itself, but potentially even increasing this polarization. So now that brings us to the question, so what about the facts? I mean, this is all about ideology, and maybe this is completely disconnected from the reality and from facts. But what, and of course, that is like the fake news debate and all that. But what you also see is that clearly partisanship and polarization leads to a filtering of information about realities, and examples in case are, of course, you know, what you want to know about things like global warming or COVID or the severeness of the COVID crisis. It also comes to the point that even if people share common facts, they attribute these facts to different, you know, people. They attribute responsibilities to different people, and they draw different conclusions when it comes to policies. So this is essentially how we view the state of the literature, that it's a very strange phenomenon. There is a very strong ideological bias, and it seems that this bias becomes more and more polarized. And it also seems that facts, you know, don't help in reconciling or bringing together these positions. So then the questions that we want to address in this context is, okay, so how can we actually understand better what's really going on the side of, okay, is it really that facts don't matter, or is it a particular pattern of facts that leads to a different perception of reality? And what we mean by that is particularly, you know, the macro environment. So is it the COVID crisis at large that is somehow, you know, not consistent with my personal ideological preferences, and that's why I tend to come to different conclusions than people from the other side? And is that the same when we break this down to the individual level? So when the shocks and the variations in the outside world are all of a sudden becoming relatively personal. And the second question that we want to answer is, so if we have these perception differences, are they really leading to ever more aggravation? And how do these perception differences, you know, react to the advent of particular shocks of the various types that I just mentioned? And how does that translate into social unrest? The way we do it and what we do, in fact, is well, we use, and now we get to the current period, well, we use the current divide that we see in the US between, you know, people that lean towards Republicans and people that lean more towards Democrats. And we try to understand more about these questions by looking at how the, you know, events that we saw earlier this year related to the COVID pandemic actually permit, you know, work themselves through society, and how they, in fact, you know, lead to polarization or potentially even an increase in polarization through different perceptions of reality. Okay, so how do we do that? Well, what we use is a really neat data set that I haven't seen that it has been used a lot. So this is a huge data set, a nationally representative survey of political attitudes that was conducted by the Gallup company. And what they did is they went out since March 13 and they interviewed people that they had on their roster of the panel, and they conducted day by day around 1,200 interviews in the early phase of the pandemic, and then since April about 500 day by day. And this is like, you know, they make sure that by the sampling, these data are nationally representative with exposed weights. They have, you know, all sorts of expertise in sampling. So we have all reasons to believe that, well, this is a fairly good coverage of the population at large. And what they do in this survey is they ask particular questions related to, you know, socio-demographics, but also COVID and policy-related questions. Then we link that up to, well, COVID-related deaths in order to have some measure of, you know, variation in the severeness of at least perceived severeness of the crisis. We link it up with unemployment data from the BLS and also additional information about state governance and party affiliations. And then finally, we also link it up with GDEL data on events of protests in order to see what about, what are the implications for social unrest. So the data that we have span basically the year 2020 until August, through end of August. That is roughly what we have in terms of data. And this is what I'm going to present to you. Now, what is the empirical approach? Well, there's not so much in terms of fancy identification strategies. Basically, what we're arguing here is, okay, I mean, for the purposes of these high frequency data, what we have is that, well, individuals presumably have fairly stable party preferences. And so the affiliation with either the Democrats or the Republicans appears to be a fairly stable trait, at least for the purpose of this analysis, as do the shocks. So, I mean, what we're going to look at is fairly high frequency variation in terms of, COVID, the severity of the COVID crisis, of the unemployment fluctuations that are related to that, and we're going to use variation at different aggregation levels when it comes to unemployment. So we're going to distinguish between the reactions that people have to state level unemployment fluctuations versus individual unemployment, job loss at the individual level. And of course, also the splits by who is governing a particular state, that we view it as predetermined. So in terms of identification, if you want, these are all predetermined variables. And what we're looking at is correlations, but we're really interested in heterogeneity in these correlations that we are interested in. Okay, so what am I going to present to you is 4 sets of results that try to address the questions that I raised before. The first one is, so are these people really living in different realities? So what can we say about what happened to them during this year and also how they perceive that in terms of expectations for future economic development, for instance? In a second step, then, we want to break it down to, okay, does that have any impact on people's emotions, in particular, things like anger, things like stress, things that might actually lead, to more social unrest or violence? Is it related to political discontent? So what are the patterns here? Are they, more or less happy with what's going on in terms of the political response to the crisis? And finally, how does that affect social tensions? What are the patterns that we can expect here, or that we find here? This is the roadmap, and I'm going to walk through these type of results in the next 15 minutes, I hope. Okay, so let me start with different perceptions about the consequences of the shock. So what we do here is we go at the individual level, and we look, okay, at responses to questions about economic well-being. And here the question really is, did you receive less on your paycheck than what you did pre the COVID crisis? And we relate it to the number of COVID-related deaths in the particular state of residence, and then plus additional controls, individual level controls, weak fixed effects, state fixed effects, and so on. And then we want to also understand what about party affiliation. So if we do that, as soon as we start conditioning on weak and state fixed effects, we see that, yes, people are somewhat more likely to respond to the question, did you receive a pay cut since March? Yes, in states and weeks where the COVID crisis was looming relatively larger. But what we don't see at all is that this has anything to do with party affiliation in the level or even in the interaction. So there's not that they respond like completely differently in terms of what happened to them, or that they have been affected differently by this shock, if you want to call it a shock, by the severity of the COVID crisis as measured by the deaths. Now, I should say, this is just literally intention to treat is just trying to have a proxy measure for the severity of what's going on and what people perceive to be the reality out there and how that is changing. A second thing is then, what about unemployment, reported unemployment at the individual level? So here the question, the dependent variable is, so did you lose your job in the context of the COVID crisis? And here what we find is that people are more likely to respond, yes, I lost a job in states and weeks where the COVID crisis was looming high, as proxied by the deaths. And again, we see, well, once we start conditioning, we see that is a fairly consistent but potentially small number. But now here we see that the main effect of being, somebody who is leaning towards Republicans is much less likely to respond that they lost the job. So if anything, the Republicans are getting better through this crisis, and there seems to be no interaction terms, so no difference in the perception of Republicans that respond differently to COVID crisis. So if anything, the people that are leaning towards Republicans are getting through that slightly better, but the shock per se seems to be fairly homogeneous. But then how does that translate into perceptions of reality or expectations? So here we take a standard measure of economic expectations and we code it as, okay, are you expecting a severe recession as a response of the COVID crisis? And you see that, well, the larger the severity of the COVID shock in a particular state and week, the more likely people are to respond, yes, so this is gonna be severe and potentially leading to a severe recession. What you see is that people that lean towards Republicans are much more positive. They are much less likely to expect a severe recession. Maybe they're even bullish if you want. But here we see a systematic difference also in terms of the reaction towards the COVID crisis. So if anything, the Republicans, they deny more that the COVID crisis actually leads to a recession. So there is some heterogeneity here. So this is just to see what is the perception of reality in terms of, in the context of different types of shocks, well, different types of shocks now in terms of the deaths of COVID, but also unemployment. So how does that relate to emotions of people? And the nice thing about the panel data that we have is we have questions about how did you feel yesterday? And what we use here in particular are responses about negative emotions that are related to anger, to stress, to worrying, to being sad, to being bored, to being lonely. We combine them using a principal component analysis. Later on, I can show you, if you just take anger, you get basically the same results. So what do we find here? So the dependent variable now is negative emotions, if you want. This is the first principal component that loads on anger. And here we regress it, individual responses on a binary variable that says in a particular month, in a particular week, in a particular state, was the number of COVID deaths above median. And then we interact that with Republican, and we do the same with unemployment. And we interact with Republican. And we have a main effect for Republican. So how does that relate? So what we find is that, let's start with the Republicans. The Republicans are more positive. They are less likely or less, responding in terms of negative emotions in general. Yeah? And the main effect is strong and negative, so they are more positive in some sense. They are less negative. But then what we also see is that the severity of the shock doesn't seem to affect people's emotions greatly, and also there is moderate heterogeneity across party lines, across partisanship. But what we see is that there is a particularly interesting difference across party lines when it comes to economic distress, when it comes to, in states where unemployment is going up particularly strongly, that's where Republicans respond to be particularly negatively emotionally affected. And once you start splitting that up into Democrat states and Republican states, what you see is, well, in the main effect, there is not much, but Republicans seem to be particularly angry in Democrat states. Now, you could think maybe they are unhappy with the policies that are in place there. We control for whether there is a curfew or not in a particular week in a particular state. So that might not drive it. And we could, of course, also control for all the individual controls. So there is, and this is, I think, what we want to stress, there is some heterogeneity here in terms of, how people react, and that is according to party lines. And with anger, you have a fairly similar picture. How about, so this was, remember, aggregate shocks. This is the number of COVID deaths in the state and in the unemployment rate in the state. What about individual shocks? So here we do a very similar regression, but we control now, or we look at what is the correlation between negative emotions and individual employment status, and the difference between Republicans and Democrats here. And again, you see that the Republicans are the more jolly people. They are less negative. But here we see no heterogeneity at all across party lines. So people get more depressed, get more angry, get more negative in terms of their emotions if they lose their job. And this has nothing to do with partisanship. So apparently the perception of aggregate things that are out there differs widely by partisan lines, but if it comes to shocks that are perceived by the individuals themselves, people are not so different. Okay, so does that translate into discontent with policies? Now here, this is like an attempt to bring it back to like, okay, does that matter for politics and the political arena? The question that we use here is imperfect, is basically a question, do you agree that the governor of your state has communicated a clear policy against the COVID, or policy how to deal with the COVID crisis, yet yes or no? The problem with that question is it might be interpreted in either has the story been clear what the governor wants to do, or is it actually good? Do you agree with that, or do you disagree with that governor's policy? And what you see is, again, the severity of the COVID crisis itself in terms of the deaths doesn't seem to affect discontent with governors, as long as you are in the pooled sample. High unemployment, for Democrats, it actually leads to less discontent, more agreement with the governor, but Republicans tend to disagree more. So here we have a level difference that is weak, but here we see that the shock itself apparently leads to a widening of the gap in discontent across, along party lines, along party divisions. And once you start splitting it up by, are we talking about people that live in a state that is governed by Democrats or Republicans, you see, well, again, this rift, this difference is there in both types of states. It might be more pronounced in the Democrat states in terms of discontent of Republican voters with the governance of a Democrat governor. But I mean, apart from that, it seems to be there. So, and you see an interesting level difference, of course, that you would expect in the main effect, which is, okay, Republicans, of course, are always more discontent with Democrat governors, and they are less discontent with Republican governors. That's fine. But what is interesting here is that, the shock seems to aggravate this discontent and this difference in the level of discontent across parties. Again, if you go for individual unemployment rates, you see the same baseline difference in terms of discontent of Republicans with Democrat governors and Republicans being less discontent with Republican governors. But what you also see here is that, as before, if people get unemployed, Democrats getting unemployed in Democrat states, they seem to not change much of their discontent, but the Republicans get more discontent in a Democrat state and vice versa. So this is really symmetric across the two states. Yeah, so individual shocks seem to be different than the consequences of aggregate shocks. And what about the perception of the economy? Again, here we see the Republicans tend to be more positive about the expecting a future recession. But again, here we see some differences in terms of the perception of the shock and interaction with Republican on the main. Again, we seem to see a widening of the gap. Here, the widening is particularly pronounced in Republican states. Okay, let me go to the last step. The last step is, okay, does that affect social tensions somehow? And the social tensions, we just use Gidelt data at the state level week by week in the US for the category 14, which is protests. And we just try to benchmark it with previous years, because I mean, this year is special for many reasons. And if you look at the aggregate data of the Gidelt week by week average, the red line is what you see week by week in 2020. You see that COVID apparently reduced these events of protests naturally, but then of course there was the increase in June related to the George Floyd events. But what we're doing now is basically just controlling for the overall week by week levels that we saw in the previous years to see whether there are any deviations. And then what do we find? We find that, well, if you look at the protests as a dependent variable, you don't see very much. If you look at unemployment as like a shock variable, if you look at, and this is state level analysis now, if you look at the severity of the COVID crisis measured by COVID deaths, you see something. There is a positive effect. So as a more severe crisis seems to lead to more protesting. But then once you start interacting, you see that this is mostly related to the economic consequences of the crisis. So the increase in unemployment. So assuming that in a state in a week where the crisis looms large in terms of COVID deaths, then the response to that will be more felt if unemployment is also responding high. That is unrelated to the definition of the protests. Final thing.
Excuse me, Uwe, it's time.
I'm almost done, QA. So if you split by states, you also see differences here. So in Republican states, it's really the interaction that works. In Democrat states, it's not the interaction; it's the main effect that works. And we did some robustness here. We have to do much more. I'm looking forward to your comments. Let me just summarize. So what were the open questions that we tried to address? So does the perception of facts really differ across party line? Is there partisan difference? Apparently, yes. But it is interesting to see that it is, not there for individual shocks. It seems to be there for these distant macro shocks where we see a lot of heterogeneity in how people perceive that. And does that, lead to some aggravation of social unrest? Apparently, yes, if you look at emotions, if you look at discontent, and if you look at social tensions. And that's what I had to say. Thanks a lot.
So that's a very, very interesting set of facts. I really enjoyed and learned a lot. One, broad questions I have about these surveys that applies more to some than to other of your slides, especially it applies to the first set, I would say. So people are worried about what they call cheerleading effect. So if you take COVID has now become, surprising or not, part of the narrative of the party and the partisanship narrative. So being a real Republican goes together with saying that that COVID is not so bad as the Democrats say. Being a hardline communist in the 1950s probably was denying that there were fake trials in the Soviet Union, even if probably people knew that was the case. So, okay, this is a general argument, but there is some evidence for that. I've read this on New York Times. So it's if you take the Democrat leaning voters and ask them, was the 2016 election fair? Then a large proportion says yes, it was, but a large proportion was denying that it was fair. And then you ask them after the 2020, the percentage among the Democrat voter that say it was fair has gone up by 22%. So I'm just saying there might be a difference between what people believe and what people claim to believe, which might affect at least part of these results. So it could be a reality, or it could be just, you know, I want to say things that my group is saying together. That's what I think what they call cheerleading effect.
Yeah, but what we did is so I don't know which results you refer to, potentially the anger ones, for instance. I would not think. Sorry?
I would say in general, the attitude towards COVID.
So in general, I think we cannot differentiate that. We cannot differentiate whether people, you know, respond because they, so this is like a bit like interviewer response, experimenter demand, so to speak. Yeah? That we cannot disentangle. But if you believe that, yes, so have you felt angry yesterday? You should answer yes, because you're living in a Democrat neighborhood and there's a lot of COVID going on, and that should make you angry or so. Well, at least, you know,
no, I agree. That part was probably immune by this, and it could be a way of going about this broad issue.
Yeah. So at least that's, I mean, that's why we try to use these aggregate things or the personal shocks. Oh, I see in the chat there.
I'm just going to jump in if that's okay.
Yes, please go ahead.
Can you? I mean, I think it's fascinating to see these coefficients, but maybe you did that. But can you kind of benchmark it with something? Like, how big are these effects compared to, I don't know, something obvious that would be like tangible, like you know, is this really these really big effects or really small effects compared to something else that might be happening? So that was one question. And the second question, I guess you have controls, but of course sometimes maybe in different states, if people get unemployed, they will be unemployed for longer, and then they get more worried about being unemployed. I think that's kind of like, it would be a good question of understanding whether long-term unemployment differs systematically across states, and that makes people react differently to unemployment. Of course, it doesn't explain necessarily the Republican Democratic difference in the reaction, but maybe there's even background, right? You are in a certain sector, and that makes you more, you're a professional barbecuer, and it makes you more Republican, and at the same time, that makes you more long-term unemployed, and that's why you react stronger. I would be interested in thinking about whether on the interaction effect, there's actually also things that are different across these groups.
So thanks. Benchmarking, we didn't think about it yet. We have to look. That's a good suggestion to just see what is there, maybe in the psych literature or something. In terms of systematic differences, I mean, everything is on state weak fixed effects. So, I mean, and this is like within half a year of data. So as long as these things are not too variable over this short period of time, it should be captured by the state fixed effects. I mean, we did some cutting. I didn't present it by demographics, and we see some heterogeneity across, you know, the share of non-white population. You see a bit stronger effects there. You know, in terms of population density, there is more in urban areas, it seems, but we have to dig deeper into these type of things. But we can.
For example, old versus young, right? I would expect that younger people are less afraid of like being unemployed now forever, whereas when you're like 50 and you become unemployed, maybe that's a much bigger shock for you personally. And I think it would be interesting either as a benchmark or like, you know, maybe that is kind of as a control. I mean, you know, it's a bit tricky to do this.
So we control for age at the individual level. We control for age, but the interaction we haven't done.
Yeah, exactly.
You're suggesting an
interaction. The control, exactly. It's about like knocking out that Republican dummy, whether that Republican interaction, whether you can knock that out with something. I don't know. I think it would still be interesting, right? I don't think it's kind of like an attack on your finding. It's much more like maybe being Republican is correlated with something else, and
yeah, I agree.
The fact is kind of convoluted, kind of confounded by that.
Great suggestion. Yeah.
Thank you so much for inviting me to present my work at the workshop. It's such an excellent opportunity. So today, I'd like to present my paper on early colonial leaders' personality and its consequences on civil conflicts in French Western Africa. I apologize in advance that some of you might have seen the paper before. So there are some new developments and some new results, but essentially the message remains very similar. So this is joint work with my co-authors, Elise Willery, Sacha Drey, and Jean-Louis Keane. Elise and Sacha are in the chat room today, and they could respond to all the tough questions. Okay, so let me start. Oops, sorry. So let me start by positioning this paper on broadly the spectrum of different types of historical studies of conflicts and developments. Okay, so on one side of this spectrum, we find most of what we do in political economy, at least the modern term that we think about it, which also dates back to structuralism in social sciences, to the École des Annales in history, and if you go far enough to Marx and the Russian thinkers, etc. In the sense of studying only large-scale socio-political economic forces as determinants, as the key variables behind development and conflicts. So to cite the philosopher Isaiah Berlin's view when talking about Russian thinkers and Tolstoy, the point was that leaders were mere ex post justifications of events that nobody had any influence on. So at the other extreme of this spectrum, we find the long tradition of the great man history, especially in terms of style view as Resonance 2003 by John Keegan, that the history of the 20th century can be studied through the biographies of 6 men. You could guess who these six men are. So in between, we have Max Weber's view that, well, leaders can be important at times, and their importance can interact quite a bit with historical forces and institutions. And this is the points where we're trying to get in with our views about leaders' personality and how it could, at the right moment and in the right condition, have very important long-term consequences. Now, this relates a lot to qualitative evidence on leaders in economics, and we've seen a lot of evidence when it comes to economic organizations, like more modern ones, like firms or banks, financial institutions, etc. But there's still quite scarce knowledge when it comes to political leaders, maybe except for the study by Jones and Alkin, and some literature here and there, especially the blossoming literature on bureaucracy. Okay. So this is the setting of our paper. We consider leaders' personalities in a historical setting of the French Western Africa territory. It's a very important part of the French colonial empire, especially during the First World War, in which the colonial district leaders, so these are French leaders who had full control of colonial districts, they were really considered as emperors without scepters, hence the name of the paper. We measure their personality by our manual text analysis of inspectors' evaluations of those leaders, and then we connect that personality to measures of hostilities at the same time, as well as post-Cold War civil conflicts data coming from the UCDP GED. And the main message is that more aggressive, versus Stalin personality of the first district administrators actually has short run, medium run, effects on hostility and has long-run effects on conflicts today. So the historical, the key source of identification that we rely on is historians' views that the assignment of administrators to districts at the time was pretty much arbitrary. So it was not an informed choice by the administration. It was not even a choice by candidates. And then to focus really on the effect here, we also look at variations within the cultural groups. So similar to what Stelios and Elias did before, and putting in a lot of observables as controls. And on top of that, we also use a control function approach to address potential endogeneity of those choices in case the administration really sorted by the quality or personality of leaders and the proneness to conflict of those districts. Okay, so the story that we try to tell is that of a mix of arbitrariness of those administrators and long-run fatality. So they were arbitrarily placed and handed really like very extraordinary power with discretion, especially when it comes to taxes to the draft, especially during the First World War, and forced labor. So they set out each district's development path, as also seen in prior work by my co-author, including the nature of the relationship with the locals, and for which personality matters a lot. So it could inspire adherence or hostility of the native population, and it probably had to develop state capacity and attitude towards the state, and potentially leading to conflicts today. So in the interest of time, let me excuse myself and skip this literature review that basically just recounts your names of a lot of people in this room. And then let me go through the historical background a little bit. So if you see, you could see here the map of the regions. It's a very big region with names that are a bit different from today. There was a bit of changes in the borders across districts, and we had to take that into account very carefully. Okay, so the military expansion started from about 1854 until early 20th century. Then after that, we had a federal civil administration from 1904 all the way until the wave of independence in 1960. So across those, the whole territory, so there are 8 colonies governed by the governors, and they're all under the direction of the general governor, the gouverneur général, who sits in the capital of the territory in Dakar. And below the governors were the district administrators, who were in control of those districts. And below them, there were the local chiefs, who were native Africans. Now, there were a few things about administrators that we should take note of. They had a lot of responsibilities, and notably in terms of tax collection, the draft, forced labor, but also in terms of investment and maintenance of public works and services. And because of the prohibitive transport and communication barriers, then they pretty much had a lot of discretionary power. So they didn't have to really report all the time to their superiors. And even, at times they could find reasons to not follow direct orders. And they had the power to issue official acts to adjudicate, and especially to exercise this indigena, which is really the courts, the special courts for indigenous people. And they can also call in military support if needed. So there's a lot of power in the hands of those emperors without scepters. And they were responsible to either ignite or appease hostility among the native population. And historians have told the story that many of them left very different legacies in terms of the legitimacy of the state, in terms of how the state interacted with the local population and the capacity of the state in terms of investments. Okay. Now, there was also a wide variation in the quality of administrators. Some were really good, coming from the, what became the ENA later on, and others were even former convicts that just tried to find a way out. So I should add that it was not a desirable job in the IOF, especially with a very high death and mortality rates. And the assignment was, if anything, very arbitrary. So because of the shortage of potential candidates for those jobs, they got assigned almost right away when they were available. And pretty much they had no knowledge beforehand among the candidates. But even by the administration in Dhaka, it was unlikely that they had a lot of knowledge about the, what awaits, especially when it comes to the first civil administrator of each district. And we also read and heard from our focus group of leaving administrators that maybe they didn't really care that much about matching any type of administrator to any type of districts. Although I'll try to deal with this potential sorting problem by using control function later on. Okay, so this is the map of all the districts, so you could see. Now, let me go through the data very briefly. So we collected data on hostility towards the colonial power from the annual political report to the governor. So those data were at the district level. We focus on the early periods, but we have the data up to 1956. Okay, for modern conflict, which is UCDP GED, so I don't need to repeat that. This is the superposition of the two data, so we see quite a bit of correlation. And we have a broad range of control variables. Notably, we use the ethnic culture to rely on the variation within each historical ethnic culture group. We also control for pre-colonial conflicts, like in Tim and Marta's paper. So this is the map with the cultural groups. Okay, so before we reach the point about personality, I just want to show this very robust result of the persistence of hostility into modern conflicts. So if you look at pre-independence hostility, so from 06 to 1956, it strongly predicts the prevalence of conflicts after 1989 today, and this is the result across UCDP cells. And even if we focus on the very first period from 06 until 1919, then again the persistence is very strong. So this is the first point that attracts us our attention a lot. Okay. Now let me get to the personality. This is a measure coming from inspectors' evaluations of administrators. So these are the evaluations. So there's not a lot of text, and which allows us to do a manual text analysis, although it's very hard to read. So at least I would have had time, but my co-authors are a lot better in doing that. So these are some examples of some words designating bad characters. So essentially we get, in the end, we sum up those categories in an index on the dimension that we could see between sort of aggressive, neurotic administrators versus nice, calm, tolerant ones. We focus on the first administrator, since we worry that later on those that follow could be more selected into those positions. So our view about the personality score is that it's just an instance. So evaluation is an instance of a latent fixed variable plus some IID noises, in which case we just average over all of the scores over available years. Now we have also run some checks, and notably what we find across different specifications is that the incidence, or any measure of hostility in the district has almost zero effect on the personality score. So we're safe to say that we think it's safe to say that our average of personality score over the whole period is a precise and good measure of administrators' personality. Okay, so this is the distribution over those places. As I said, in the end we only have 66 districts left because it's quite stringent in terms of getting the data from those historical archives. Okay, so we also check that personality score is quite balanced in the sample. If anything, we find slight selection of actually good personality score being assigned to districts that are a bit harder or harsher and more prone to conflict. So if anything, that would create a bias against finding the results. Okay. I've talked about the identification. Now let me show first the main results here. These are different regressions with different sets of controls. We'll focus on the last one, which has a bit of a weaker results of the personality score of the first administrator on the prevalence of hostility between, in the first period between 1906 to 1919. In the last column, what we use is the post-double selection lasso, since we have a lot of controls here. Throughout we see that there's quite some negative effect, meaning that higher, so better personality scores, meaning administrators who are more tolerant, the nicer, tend to reduce the hostility toward, between the native population and the colonial administration. So we have the same results in terms of conflict intensity, hostility intensity instead of prevalence. Okay. Now looking at different periods for subsequent periods, we see that the effect, if anything, is even stronger. And overall, we see that pre-independence hostility is clearly strongly associated with the personality score of the first administrator across the sample. Okay. Now, when we look at the long-term effects on conflicts today, so after 1989, then again, across different specifications, we see that there's a strong association with a strong effect here, using here, it doesn't matter to use the lasso, and both for prevalence and also for conflict intensity, the effect is quite strong. Now, let me spend maybe 2 minutes to talk about the threats of sorting and how we may deal with it. Okay, so take a look at this regression of hostility on personality with the threat of an observable U that may correlate with personality. So we could always write this in the control function approach. The unobservable is a function of personality. Now, beta, the coefficient of personality, is certainly not identifiable if in the standard case where this coefficient rho is a constant. Now, what we argue is that the sorting by the administration can be quite particular. So first, as I said before, the candidates had no idea about sorting. So it was, if anything, the sorting must have been done by the administration. And so therefore, it must have been a sorting among all candidates that were available at the same time. And in that sense, the correlation between the unobservable and personality here should be an increasing function of the number of other administrators available around that time. So we fix the period at 4 months before and 4 months after each administrator. Okay, and the key assumption for identification here is that if there is no other administrators, if Ri is equal to 0, then there's no sorting, because the arrival process of the candidates is, as we argue, really random. Okay, so based on this, we can put this expression back and derive this control function, which is the interaction of the number of other administrators and personality score. And now the error term is conditionally independent of the personality and of this new control. And so we could identify the effect beta of personality by adding this control. Okay. Now we could go a bit further by considering that, well, this relationship between the unobservable components and the number of other administrators may not be linear. So one way to think about it is that suppose we have two sequences. So one sequence of the personality of administrators and the other sequence of this unobservable quantity U, say, the proneness to conflicts. Then we just sort the two and compute the correlation between the two will be an increasing function of the number of candidates here, the other candidates. And so we could just use a simulation to compute empirically this correlation as this function rho of Ri. So now it's no longer a linear function. And we could again put back in the regression the same way and use a somewhat new control function to identify again the coefficient of personality. So once we apply this method, these are the results. So we find that actually the results are a bit stronger. And this is due to the fact that the control coefficient turns out to be positive, meaning that administrators with good personality were actually assigned to more conflict-prone districts. So this looks exactly like the, some of the suggestive evidence that we found in the balance tests. And if anything, this would mean that the real effects of the first administrator's personality is even stronger than what we had estimated before. So this is for the simple control function. For the more complex way of computing the control function, if anything, we find even a stronger result. So I should add that this introduces a lot of curvature in this control function, and I would take this as more suggestive. So we have done other robustness checks. So as I've shown some of them, the results remain very similar with the intensity of conflicts instead of the prevalence. So the results are very robust to dropping any period, to additional controls by personal characteristics, to dropping districts, especially Casamance, which was by far like the highest concentration of hostility that we found. And we found that the effect comes from the first administrators and controlling for the first administrator, not the later ones. So confirming what historians have already told about the selection of the later administrators. Now, how did this happen? Especially how did conflicts could persist until today? So this is, I have to say that this is still quite a puzzle that we want to address, but we're still trying to find ways to do. So one way we have thought about this is the view that was already mentioned by Jeff Herbst and tested by the paper by Elias and Stelios, in which state capacity was pretty much shaped by the colonial administration and much closer to the capital city. Okay, and this relates a bit to my earlier work with Felipe and Bernardo on the fact that in places with weak institutions, conflicts happen much closer to the capital city. So we could test this by looking at specifically conflicts closer to the colonial main city, which become the capitals of the independent states after independence. So we see that the effect is a lot stronger when it comes to those cells within 100 kilometers of the colonial main city. So we could either control for modern development or not, and since these are bad controls, we show it both ways. And our placebo test here shows that there's no effect on non-state conflict events. So again, consistent with the state capacity view, this is mostly with the state-related conflicts. Okay, and we're still working on well, in terms of exploring potential results on taxes, and also on individual attitudes towards paying taxes and national identity through the Afrobarometer. So I have reached the end. So let me just repeat in one word that, one sentence, that early colonial local leaders matter to civil conflict. And this sort of is important for policy in the sense that we should repeat what others have done, that civil conflicts in Africa are partly rooted in its colonial history. And it's important to understand that colonial history well to really have good policies for development today. So let me stop here.
Thank you. So I'm not sure if I'm seeing or not seeing the hands, but
I have
no.
one hand.
Please go ahead.
Okay.
Okay, thanks. I have two questions, but maybe I missed some. You explained it and I missed it. The first one is, when you say that they are arbitrarily assigned to the districts, do they have the possibility to say no? So they know if they have this possibility, how this affect identification, because probably they know the characteristics of the district. And the second question is that the information on the personality, maybe I missed this, is before that they are assigned to the districts or after?
Thanks, Marta. So from what I understand, they were just assigned. I mean, this was already not a very desirable place to go, but they had to go there. It was an assignment, and so they would just have to go to wherever they were assigned. I mean, it was a tough position for most of them. They had to travel like a long trip that took several days. I mean, if you have read The Heart of Darkness, then it's like a similar story. It's a tough time, and so yes, it was so from historians' account of the story, I don't think that they had a choice in that. For the second question, so that's a very important point. We for most of them, we look at the full set of evaluations, including evaluations that took place after their first stint. So it has to do, so let me get back to that slide that I mentioned about, the personality score here. Our view is that those scores, so those evaluations done by different inspectors at different times, really reflected on their personality. So it was a long evaluation, and the inspectors said about other things elsewhere, and then this part was pretty much about the personality. Now, of course, we have to worry that what has happened in the districts may affect the evaluation that those guys got from the inspector. So that's why we ran an extensive set of regressions, trying to see whether the hostility that took place before, so to be more precise, the hostility that took place between two evaluations actually had any effect on the evaluation after that. So we saw that across many specifications, the estimate is very close to zero. So I would argue that, and even more than that, when we try to put in, a dynamic structure of this score, there's very little. I mean, if anything, it's not much of a dynamic structure except for like the individual fixed effect component. So I would argue that we basically just need to get to that fixed component, and we could consider that as fixed to each administrator.
So this is a paper about the conflict in Syria that has 4 co-authors, apart from me and Dominic, Michael Koenig and Matthias Koenig are involved. I guess with this audience, I don't spend much time in telling how important the Syrian civil war is, and tragic and devastating conflict, the most devastating one in the 3rd millennium, with an estimated death toll that raises as high as 580,000 people, and it's you know, an estimate that obviously has a large margin of error. So here we present a paper that is based on a structural theory, and we focus on a particular and yet to us important aspect of the conflict. So this is a very highly fragmented conflict, which started in 2011 as a popular rebellion to oust Bashar al-Assad's government. I guess there was already at the time a double dimension. One that was, you know, protest for democracy, and another that was the ethnic divide, because between Shia minority and the Sunni majority of the population. But this was not the you know, the dimension of the conflict. It certainly did not stop there. In fact, it's evolved quickly into a multidimensional conflict, which involves several groups that pursue very different agendas. And each group, or almost each group, had some foreign sponsor and some foreign enemy. So think about the cause of the Kurds, that who are, would like to set an independent Kurdish state, and that of course has a historical element of tension with Turkey, where a large part of the Kurdish population lives. Syria, the government of Syria has received right away support from the Shia Iran and from the Lebanese militia Hezbollah, that is a strict ally of Iran, and also of Russia, which is also a traditional ally of Syria. It's not obvious that Iran and Syria, and that Iran and Russia are allied. They have not been in all dimension of international arena, but certainly they have a very correlated interest in that region. Then there was the rebellion that was initially organized in an umbrella organization called the Free Syrian Army. This was initially supported by the US and by Britain, by essentially all the Western nations that saw some type of you know, pro-democracy and pro-Western platform. But this umbrella organization was also internally very fragmented and incoherent, and in fact, the internal balance of power shifted very quickly into more sectarian directions, and at some point, the US abandoned completely the support of this organization that has now changed and is currently receiving the support of Turkey and Qatar. The Islamic State took advantage of the chaos in which the country precipitated and controlled an important amount of the territory in the east of the country. There is no official sponsor of the Islamic State in terms of foreign power. The Syrian Democratic Forces, Peshmerga, so Kurdish forces, at some point received the support, also military, of the United States, and they fought together against ISIS, also together other actors. But when this was over with a somewhat controversial decision, the US or the Trump administration withdrew, leaving these Kurdish forces at the mercy of the historical enemy Turkey. And then, although the Syrian Democratic Forces was initially an enemy of military forces of Syria, of Assad's government, for obvious reason, they were forced to come to some agreement with them. So all this was quite complex. And then there was another unit, which was this umbrella organization of Salafite radical Islamic groups, which initially was mostly led by al-Nusra, but then other group joined, and now the name of the organization is Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. This organization is, it's unclear to what extent it's coordinated with activity of Al-Qaeda. There have been episodes of cooperation and episodes of fights even. So all this to say, there is no doubt that this is a complicated geography in terms of conflict. And in the past, we have contributed to the study of fragmented conflict by proposing a model of network that can be precisely applied to the study of situation where the conflict has many non-transitive links. It cannot be reduced to two fronts or two groups fighting one against another. So what we're going to do in this paper is to present a version of that model, propose a new strategy of estimation, and I will say why we need that, and add to this an important element, which is endogenous network formation. And we will use this to run counterfactuals. And because this is a short presentation, I will focus on one of such counterfactuals. So some of you, I'm not pretending all of you, but some of you might be familiar with our earlier work on the Great War of Africa. Let me say in which way it is different. The model you will see, you recognize, if you know that paper, you recognize the same structure of the theoretical model, but the way in which we achieved the econometric identification when estimated that model was through an IV strategy. So we are using the best response equation of the Nash equilibrium of that model, and because of an endogeneity problem, so the fighting of a group would be a function of the fighting of other groups, depending on what relationship they were, being allied or being enemies. Well, we needed an exogenous source of variation, and we used, like others have done for other papers, rainfall variation as an exogenous source of variation over time. So we're sort of pretending that the conflict would, that every year there would be a new conflict, but with a variation in the weather condition, and then use that source of variation to identify structural parameters, and in particularly the strength of the externality that you will see in the model that link the action of allied and enemy groups. Now, the Great War of Africa, however sad it is, has from the researcher's point of view the characteristics that there are many years of conflict, and also that it happens in a part of the world where rainfall is a salient issue. In Syria, neither is true. So we have at least the data we have found for the type of data we need are more limited, so only for more recent years. In any case, the length of the war is not comparable to the one of the Congo War, and there are different climatic conditions. So there is no such thing as variation in rainfall that can be productively used. We tried some other things like sandstorm, but these are more like short-term things that do not really create the type of variation that we would like. So we had to think if in a situation where we have much more constraint from the data point of view, we can still learn something from a model like that. And another important difference is that we think that addressing the endogeneity of the network is an important issue. It could be that also in the Congo War it was. We think that this is even more prominent. So the difference here is that we are not going to take our best reply function and estimate them, but we are essentially going to an entirely structural approach. So the entirely structural approach, you will see, directly exploit the structure of the network as a source of variation, and then we have to recognize that that source of variation may not be exogenous. So a highlight on the main result. The first one is that we were pleased by that. After doing it in a completely different way, we find very similar estimates for the key structural parameters across the two studies. So there are two parameters that you will see identify the strength of network externalities, and in a completely different type of environment and in different conflict, we find a similar size. And the other is that, well, the endogenous nature of the network formation turns out to be very important in understanding some of the counterfactors. Okay, so I will not spend time in describing in detail how we construct the network, and and also how the data we use are constructed. Partly because this is uses essentially the same strategy that we use in our earlier work, but it's useful to say we use the Stanford Mapping Militants project, especially for the construction of the network. As in the past, when this is useful to map the relationship between large actors. When it comes to smaller groups, the information is incomplete, and so we use as part of the information to construct the network what we see on the ground. So if two groups systematically fight together, they are classified as allied, and if they fight on opposite front, they are classified as enemies. This has an obvious concern about endogeneity that in part, I would say, we try to address, but also already at the data construction stage, we use only the first part of 2017 to infer the network links, and we don't use those data for estimating the model, just for additional caution. Okay, so the model, we have a collection of groups that are contesting over a divisible prize denoted by B. Can think of this as control over territories or over natural resources. And these groups interact through a network, G, where each dyad, so each pair of groups, can be in one of the following three states: alliance, enmity, or neutrality. So usually networks have like two states. You are connected or not connected. Here you can have either a positive or a negative connection, or no connection. And again, we use the expert literature or in part the data from ACLED that reveal how these groups behave to construct that network. So formally, we represent the set of bilateral states by a sign adjacency matrix A associated with a network where we have links of the type 1 and links of the type -1. So here is how the network in Syria looks like. And these are all the groups we use, which look many. Unfortunately, from the econometric point of view, there are not that many. So for instance, here you have red and blue connection that represent enmities and alliances. And I'm not pretending that you will be able to figure out for each group how it looks like. But the Islamic State, which is here represented as very central, if you look carefully, almost all connection, actually all connection to the Islamic States are red. There are some that look blue, but it's just a visual impression. There is one blue that's connecting Free Syrian Army to the Islamist militia. Islamic State is not a friend of either. So Islamic State is very central in the standard Bonacci sense, but it's central in the network of enmities. Whereas other groups like military forces of Syria have many enemies, but also many friends. And other groups are like generally more peripheral. So in this model, each group chooses a fighting effort in a non-cooperative way, and the payoff is determined by a generalized Talloc contest success function. And what does that say? Well, the payoff, let's say, of a group, the profit or the payoff, perhaps more likely, is the share of the pie that is appropriated net of the cost of fighting. So here, X, bold X is a vector that represents all the fighting effort, and XI is the effort of the group that we are focusing upon. So this is the payoff for group I is a function of how much the group I is going to grasp and of how much it fights. Now, in a standard Talok context success function, the term involving the phi I here would just be the effort of that group divided by the total effort, which effort we can map in the data into the number of episodes in which they fight. Well, here our contribution, and this is why we call it generalized Talok context success function, is that we assume that the original Tullock function is modified by something we call operational. So something we call operational effort is not just the amount of fighting the group does, but it's also the amount of fighting done by the groups that are allied that strengthen somehow the action of that group, and the amount of effort that is exercised by groups that are classified as enemy. That undermines that type of effort. And then there is a part that is not, that there is an error term here. So these parameters beta and gamma are the spillovers that give nature to how much of a multiplier we have in the action throughout the network. Actually, beta, the alliances are going to attenuate the explosion of activity. Gamma is going to instead create more fighting activity in the best response function. So what each group does, it solves this, the maximization of pi I, taking the effort of the other group as given, and then you solve for the Nash equilibrium of this. So one way to go is to go to the first order condition of this problem and then estimate those first order conditions, recognizing an endogeneity problem. But we can do more, because the first order conditions that are linear allow an inversion that gives us another representation of the Nash equilibrium, which is here expressed in matrix form, where you see on the right hand side you don't see any X, but you just see complicated objects that are all network specific. So somehow, without entering the math of this expression, on the right hand side, you have the structure of the network as the source of variation, and then you have a vector of error terms that can represent idiosyncratic characteristics of the group that affect the incentive to fight. Okay? So those error terms are important for us. Because if we took this and say, well, why don't we run a regression and we say it's IID? Well, a part that we couldn't do because there's a lot of nonlinearity, or even in the first term. But there would be a lot of things that have not network specific that could matter. For instance, the size of the group, its militant motivation, and other such factors. So somehow we recognize that these factors have are not just IID, but they are a function of characteristics of the group. Some of them may be observable, and some of them are possibly latent. And that will be an important part of the story I'm going to tell you. So what we ideally would like to do, if we had a panel, would be to estimate this, to add fixed effects. But here we're going to have only a cross section, so we cannot, of course, treat these as a fixed effect. Although in the end, in some way, we do it. Okay, so let's do the first the simple thing. The simple thing is to write the likelihood function of this problem. So we write the likelihood function of this, and we estimate the parameters of this model. So note that we are using all the nonlinearities that are embedded in the structure of the model that tell us about all the multiplier that are associated to the activity of each group because of the place where each group is in the network. So if you have a lot of enemies, this will tell you will fight really hard. That will be someone like Islamic State. If you have a lot of allied and not many enemies, you will be predicted to fight less. So this is the sense in which we go entirely structural. We find beta and gamma that maximize the likelihood that the data come from a particular configuration of the model. We have to deal with some technical issues, which are not unimportant. For a couple of groups, the multiplier explodes. So we are going to have a maximum on the ability of the group to fight, and that maximum is pinned down for the group where the model say, well, it would explode. We say, well, they are fighting the maximum they can. So we are thinking implicitly or explicitly that there is some non-convexity and that it's an L-shaped function. So you cannot, in particular, the military force of Syria will be estimated to fight as much as they can, not so much strategically thinking about how the allied and the enemies are doing. Other groups are responsible on that margin. Now it comes to network formation. Network formation here is important because this way of thinking suffers from a problem. So suppose that we have a group that is especially virulent. Take again the example of the Islamic State. One of the reasons why it may be fighting so hard, it's not only because they are central in the network, which should be part of the model, but they may also have some characteristics of the extreme radicalism of their message, the motivation of the militants, and so on. So that characteristic could be an independent driver of the incentive to fight. But the problem is, well, that could still be an error term, but the problem is that it could also be one of the reasons why that group has so many enemies. So the network formation will recognize that possibility. So we'll recognize that some groups may have a high, as a function of characteristics of the group and also of characteristics of the bilateral links, some links may be more likely, and that can be correlated with characteristics of the group that have a direct effect on fighting. So if we omit that, we may have by construction correlation between the error terms and regression. So that's why we introduce a network formation model where the likelihood of each link between I and J is modeled as a random utility model. That, among other things, increases the number of observations we have because we don't have many groups, but we have many links. So then we're going to estimate the joint likelihood function of the fighting effort, which comes from the Nash equilibrium, and of the random utility model that gives the network formation model, which is a multinomial logic. We write down, we should give to Michael Koenig the merit for working out this was not so easy. And in the end, we can run a maximum likelihood estimation, which in fact, because of the constraint I told you before, we have to modify in some way. I won't have time to. Now, to have an idea of what we are doing, essentially, this procedure allows us to estimate latent group-specific effects a little bit as if this was a panel, because we will have fixed effects down there that are estimated from the process of network formation. And again, we'll capture the fact that these effects are going to have an effect also on the propensity to fight. So it will look as if actually we have fixed effect in a regression that doesn't have time dimension because we are using this information from network formation. Okay, so let's see what happens when we estimate the model. So the first column is running a naive OLS. Oh, by the way, beta and gamma here are consistent with my notation. The expectation is that they should both be positive because the gamma has a minus in front. So the fact that they are positive is consistent with our prior. But the OLS regression just ignore all these issues I told you about, and it takes the best response function and it runs the fighting effort of one group on the fighting effort of the allies and the fighting effort of the enemies without any other consideration. And it gives you some estimated parameters. Now, the structural approach already takes into account that there are some restrictions that are imposed by the theory that in particular allows you to retrieve the value of the price, which is also an object that is estimated here. And that better be positive, and it is positive. So these are the externalities that we retrieve from the structural maximum likelihood approach. When we endogenize the network, well, we have many more observations now. We don't find huge differences. You see, those numbers are not huge. it's nice that they are very similar to those we have estimated for Congo. It could be luck at this point. I cannot deny that. The fact that they are not similar should not lead you to say, okay, so much fast for nothing, because the endogeneity of the network will be very important in the counterfactual. So even if the externalities are not estimated very different when we have an endogenous or an exogenous network, they will be consequential for the counterfactual analysis. Okay, so here is how it looks like with the fixed effect I told you about. So mu plus is the propensity of a group to have to form positive alliances, to form alliances. You see, many of them, like military forces of Syria, has a number that is similar to others. Islamic States, it's not a friendly, organization. In fact, there's a very strong negative tendency to form alliances, which enters as information in part in the estimation. And then on the negative, this is the propensity, the mu minus is the propensity to form enmities. You see, in this case, the Islamic State is once again the most unfriendly of the groups, but Assad's military forces, of course, have also many enemies. So this is the result of the estimation that depends on all this bilateral link and the structure. Okay, so how do we assess the success of this model? Well, this model gives us something which we have not used at all in the estimation, because we are only looked at the fighting effort, and that something is how much, what share of the territory does each group control. Okay, so we have independently estimated the share of control over cities, because large part of the territory in Syria is desert, and it was not so easy to get all the information on how to weigh this relative to cities. So this is a control over city, and here you see, we have created some large groups that are mostly consistent of alliances, and I'm showing you how much the observation on the vertical axis correlate with the prediction of the model, and it's a high correlation. And you could think it's because the more you fight, the more you control. Well, if you use that simple alternative model, the fit is less good. Okay, so then we run counterfactual analysis. So a classical type of counterfactual you do in this model is so-called key player analysis. So suppose that I remove from the conflict one agent at a time. There are many more things we could do. We could create, you try to pacify links, to have an intervention that limited hostilities between this group. All of this we have done in the earlier work. Well, here one thing is clear, that the Islamic State is very important for the violence of the conflict, at least in the period we have considered. So what you see here, delta RD, means the change in anticipation. If you want, this is a measure, an aggregate measure of the conflict. It says that in the fixed network and in the endogenous network, respectively, the decrease would be, so the number of episodes of war would decrease by the order of 62%. So it says the large number of events that we observe are either involve the Islamic State, which is involved, but in no more than 15% of the event, or they are somehow related to the Islamic State and the effect that it creates around it. Okay, so now let's try to make the following thought experiment. Removing the Islamic State is interesting because the Islamic State at some point was actually removed. It was wiped out. So the way we do it, well, we say, because the part of the data we have has the Islamic State until March 2019, what if we think of this as a situation where there is the Islamic State, and then we think about what happened later? And loosely speaking, we can really relate to reality. Here is what you see. So who gains and who loses? You see four numbers here, four columns. The first and the second is the change in the intensity of fighting, let's say of Turkey. So after the Islamic State is gone, because of all the effect through the network, the model predicts that Turkey would fight 36% less. After there is rewiring of the network, so once the endogeneity of the network is taken into account, how do we do it? Well, you have to create a new scenario where there is no Islamic State, and then you run thousands of simulations on that, and then you create the average across those networks, and you say, well, in that case, Turkey will fight 45% less. What about the control of territory? Here you see a huge difference. Turkey gains a lot in the short run, according to our model, and loses in the long run. Who gains in the long run? In the long run, the big gain accrues to the military forces of Syria. 81% of the territory of the military forces of Syria have increased. As you know, this happens to be what happens in reality. So the Assad has gained control over a large part of the territory. The Petrova has come to terms with them, so it's unclear the extent to which we should consider Syrian Democratic Force to have lost. Certainly, here they don't lose all the territories, but they lose 30% of it. And we can do this disaggregated at the level of each of the blocks, or even in principle each of the group. Of course, with all 34 groups, it becomes a little also less clear to figure out what happened in the data, because some groups at some point stop existing or stop fighting. But here we have created this large, so we have attached this group to one of these large umbrellas, and you see what happens. Again, in all cases, the model predicts that the Syrian army would take again control. Why? There are two things. First of all, the military forces of Syria, according to the structural estimation, are fighting as much as they can, which I think it's not a terrible description of what we see in the narrative of they were very much constrained by their capacity to control the territories. It's not that there was some strategizing, whereas for other forces, of course, Turkey, for instance, could have used more, could have intervened with stronger military force. They decided to intervene to some extent. Same is true for the United States. So the military forces of Syria do not fight less because the Islamic State disappears. That's effect number one. The effect number two is that when we allow for the network recomposition, the structure of the alliances that Assad has are more resilient. So the Islamic State goes away. It's not the case that Syria loses its link with Russia or with Hezbollah. Those links are predicted by the model to be very stable because they are in solid ground, religious, geostrategical. When you go to a country like Turkey, it's more connected with a large number of groups, and these connections are looser. When you look inside the Free Syrian Army, the same is true. Well, you know that in reality, the United States has left, so they have abandoned the Peshmerga ally. So again, the model, not point by point, but broadly speaking, predicts that. And the same is true if I look at enmities, but I am over time. So let me just conclude. We estimate a structural model of fragmented civil war, which is close in spirit and more than that to our previous work. But we have a novel estimation strategy, which is, at some level, uses really very limited amount of information, and in that sense, you can transfer easily to another conflict when you don't have the abundance of data you have, like in the African case. We emphasize that estimated structural parameters, this network externality, which are the parameter of the model, are estimated to be very similar to those we retrieved in the Congo War study. And perhaps we need more evidence to make that claim stronger. So the model fits the data in some non-targeted dimension, like the share of territories controlled by different groups. And we do some counterfactual. I call here semi-counterfactual because the Islamic State has actually disappeared in reality, and somehow it can inform us about the predictions and how credible they are. Well, the two things are that the military force of Syria enjoy more solid alliances, whereas other alliances are more fragile, and the fact that they are constrained at the maximum fighting effort that they can exercise, whereas the other group, they may adjust in a strategic way. Thank you.
So Fabrizio, There was a question in the chat. These mu are structural estimates, no standard errors there.
Sorry.
I gave an answer, but I answered it to the wrong, not to everybody. I clicked on the wrong button. So yes. Maybe let you answer.
Yes, but sorry, it is my mistake. I did not report them, but there are standard errors there. So and it's using a Bayesian procedure that is quite sophisticated, and I have to admit that I wouldn't be able to explain how exactly it is done. I would need one of my two missing votes, unless Dominic wants to try. But we do construct standard errors.
Hannes and Maria.
So I have two maybe even technical questions. So first, did you try to look at the counterfactual in which you, instead of deleting the groups, you split one of the existing group into two and keep the same kind of links? And then what would happen? So that could be like realistically, for example, some fighting groups can in reality do something like splitting during the course of armed conflict. So I think that would be interesting. And another thing is how sensitive are the results to particular network formation model that you use? If you pick something else, then would results, I don't know, I know that there are several types of them, so that's why I'm asking. Maybe others are not applicable for your case.
Yeah, so very good questions, Maria. So first of all, the first one is I think excellent question, because there are many splinters in this model, and perhaps we could do and should do something. Let me tell you the difficulty of doing that. So when I remove one group, that group doesn't exist anymore, and it goes away the set of links, it goes away the individual effect of that group that comes through the error term. In what you suggest, I would have to somehow make some call, and perhaps I could try to think it based on observable, on what happens to the error term for those two groups. Because those two groups, for instance, if they are smaller groups, they would not adapt to the same power that a group like Islamic State would have. So that would be somehow the technical challenge. Otherwise, we could just do it, as you say, we just construct a counterfactual network where instead of one group, there are two, but we should be careful in not assuming that it's a duplication, because we would want to have some way of saying that these two groups are smaller in size. Yeah, so the network formation, I guess, of course, there might, we use two models here, right? So one is a very clear microfoundation. The network formation model is a logistic. So we have, again, microfoundation, but it's more of the reduced form type, in which the probability of a link being formed between two groups is a function of a set of observable, like in a random utility model. So we could try to change that, and I think that it will not be so easy, because that structure gives us a lot of mileage in also calculating things. But of course, I can only speculate about how other models would do.
Okay, thanks.
So thanks a lot. I think this is really fascinating, like using the full structural approach to do this. I was wondering, because you space a lot in your arguments, right? It's kind of like you just use it as validation, but I was interested in kind of two related questions regarding this. One is, is it possible at all to make specific groups attack specific other groups? Right now it's just like, you're attacking all groups, kind of, right? All groups that you're against, you're attacking them all at the same time. Of course, that's not realistic, and I think that's kind of like leading to some measurement error, right? So couldn't you use maybe the fact that you know which groups are bordering which other groups, kind of use that information and saying, well, if that group is very active, it will mostly hit these specific other groups, and kind of maybe a crossover to my work with Dominic. And wouldn't that lead to better fit? And my second question is a bit like, you say in the end, in the last slide, yeah, it's very easy to apply this to other conflicts. And given that your estimates are so stable across the two cases, aren't you tempted to kind of just take Iraq and see what happens when you apply it, and do a full out of sample? I think that would be very exciting if you get some traction on the Iraqi conflict from just the structure.
Yes, so a model in which aggression is bilateral is beyond the scope and the potential of this of the way in which the model is constructed, with the following line of defense. So this is a model where everyone is fighting for the same pie. There is a pie in the middle. Everyone is shooting against everyone else, but less frequently against your allies and more frequently against your enemies. So you could say that the model captures in a very limited way what you have in mind, but that's not to say that we literally have the count of the bilateral event and we use this bilateral information. The model, unfortunately, can only exploit some type of aggregate measure of mobilization, and again, the way the Tulloch function is generalized allows us to think. So imagine I had the perfect data. I could say, okay, instead of having only one beta and one gamma, I have 100 of those, and then I would exploit the fact that the conflict is more targeted against the ultra enemy, a little less against the semi-enemy, and so on. So that's the way I would say that model could go if there were more data. Otherwise, one has to use a different class of models. So yes, expand to other conflicts. Yes, of course, it's I agree. It's tempting and to do it. The construction of the network is an intense exercise. We tried really to. I didn't enter the details here. The expert literature would give us some information that is, of the type, these groups are allied, this type of enemy. And then we go to the newspapers and we try to get more information from there. And ultimately, we also rely on the ACLED, which is the easiest one, but also the one we feel less happy about. So we want to have most of our variation coming from, let's say, more exogenous sources. So my only excuse is it takes time to do it. It's not that you can just take the data import to the computer, but definitely it's something we would like to do.
But for my first question, so just a quick follow-up. I didn't mean that you do a full dyadic thing where every group has a different relationship with every other group. I just meant that, like, do a very lazy way of what I said is just like to code more groups as neutral, right? If maybe they hate each other, but they're not next to each other, so their effort will not be immediately relevant for. I meant something like that, like taking a shortcut using the space to inform like more neutral relationships, maybe, or I just meant like kind of like this broad coding of who's against each other. You could modify that slightly.
Yeah, it's again in the spirit of my answer. You could have different degrees of enmities. I suspect that already our coding. So our coding does not say if I am a radical Sunni and you are a Shia, we are enemy. It is not. It's not. It doesn't go in that direction. Most likely, if those groups are sufficiently far away and never fight, they would, unless there are some deep historical root, our code would say they are neutral. Actually, our code, if anything, has another concern that we have addressed tried to address in the earlier work, is that there might be too few links that are coded relative to the reality.
I suspect that the case you would describe would give me a neutral most of the time.
Okay, I see, okay.